The jagged piece of titanium Elena Vance pulled from the compressor blade of the #2 engine was no larger than a thumbnail. But as she held it in the palm of her grease-stained hand under the floodlights of Hangar 3 at Fort Campbell, she knew the upcoming mission into the North Cascades was already a funeral procession. It was 03:42 on a Tuesday, the kind of damp Kentucky morning where the air felt like a wet wool blanket and the smell of JP-8 jet fuel seemed to seep into a person's very pores. Elena didn't look up when the heavy steel door at the far end of the hangar groaned open. She didn't need to. She knew the cadence of the footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, and possessed by the unearned confidence of a man who had spent more time behind a mahogany desk than a cyclic stick. She was a Chief Warrant Officer too, a maintenance test pilot for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. In a world of Tier 1 operators and high-altitude legends, Elena was the person who told the legends if their horses were healthy enough to ride. Usually, they listened. Usually, the word of a woman who could identify a faulty bearing by the pitch of its whine was law. But this morning was different. This morning, there was a timeline dictated by a 4-star general in D.C., and Elena Vance was the only thing standing between a political win and a logistical nightmare. She wiped her hand on a rag that was more grease than fabric, the grit of the metal shard still stinging her palm. She was 32 years old, born and raised in the high desert of Bend, Oregon, where her father had run a scrapyard that specialized in heavy machinery. By the age of 10, she could strip a diesel engine blindfolded. By 16, she understood that machines didn't lie, even when the people who owned them did. That was why she joined. The Army had a logic to it, or it was supposed to. A component failed, you replaced it. A rule was broken, you faced the consequences. But as she watched Colonel Silas Thorne approach, his flight suit crisp and his face set in a mask of professional impatience, she realized the logic of the machine was being overruled by the ego of the man. Thorne didn't look at the engine. He didn't look at the shard in her hand. He looked at his watch. He was a man who measured success in minutes and career milestones, and Elena was currently costing him both. "Vance," he said, his voice a low gravel that he used to signal authority without having to raise it. "The weather window in Washington state is closing. We have 2 MH-47 Chinooks fueled and ready, and a PJ team from Lewis McCord waiting for the handoff. Why is your bird still opened up like a cadaver?" Elena held out her hand, offering the piece of titanium. It was a small, jagged thing, silver and cruel. "Because this cadaver has a heart murmur, Colonel. This came out of the #2. It's a fatigue fracture. If I'm seeing this in the compressor, it means the harmonic balance is off. It might fly for 10 hours, or it might disintegrate the moment you hit a mountain wave at 10,000 feet. I'm grounding 402. Thorne didn't take the shard. He didn't even lean in to inspect it. He just stared at her, his eyes cold and dismissive. "The maintenance logs say 402 had a full overhaul 3 weeks ago. It's the newest airframe in the fleet, Chief. You're telling me a brand new turbine is shedding blades." "I'm telling you what I found," Elena said, her voice flat and controlled. She felt the rage simmering at the base of her throat, a hot, dry heat, but she kept it locked down. She had learned long ago that a woman in her position didn't get to be angry. If she was angry, she was emotional. If she was firm, she was difficult. So she was neither. She was simply a recording device for the truth of the machine. "I don't care what the log says. The metal doesn't read the log, it just breaks." Thorne stepped closer, entering her personal space in a way that was meant to remind her of the disparity in their ranks. He was a foot taller, a decorated veteran of 3 conflicts, and the commanding officer of the task force. She was a wrench-turner with a flight suit. "This mission is a classified recovery of a high-value surveillance package that went down in the Cascades. If we don't get it before the snowstorm hits tonight, the Chinese or the Russians will have a satellite fix on it by morning. We don't have another heavy-lift bird prepped for high-altitude extraction. You have 30 minutes to button this up and sign the release." "I won't sign it," Elena said. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the distant hum of the hangar's ventilation system and the rhythmic drip of water from a leak in the roof. Thorne's jaw tightened. "Then I'll find someone who will. You're dismissed, Vance. Go home, get some sleep. You're clearly seeing ghosts in the machinery." He turned on his heel and walked toward the maintenance office where a younger, more ambitious warrant officer was waiting with a pen and a need to please. Elena stood by the hulking shadow of the Chinook, the G model she had spent the last 6 hours sweating over. She felt the weight of the titanium in her pocket. She wasn't seeing ghosts. She was seeing physics. She didn't go home. She went to the locker room, splashed cold water on her face, and waited. She knew how this would go. Thorne would get his signature. The mission would launch. And because she was the most experienced MTP on the roster, and because the mission required a technical specialist on board to oversee the recovery of the package, which was actually a sophisticated sensor array that required delicate handling, she would still be on that flight. Thorne might hate her, but he wasn't stupid enough to go into a technical recovery without the best technician he had. She sat on the wooden bench, her back against the cold metal lockers, and thought about her dog, Socket. He was a scruffy terrier mix she'd found shivering under a trailer in Clarksville. He was currently with her neighbor, probably hogging the couch. She found herself wondering if she'd remembered to leave the extra bag of treats on the counter. It was a strange thought to have when a colonel had just essentially called her incompetent, but Elena's mind worked in compartments. There was the work, there was the machine, and there was the life she tried to keep separate from both. 2 hours later, the order came. She wasn't being sent home. She was being reassigned to the flight crew of 402 as the primary technical observer. It was Thorne's way of twisting the knife, making her fly on the bird she claimed was dying. The flight from Fort Campbell to the staging area in Washington was a long, vibrating blur of gray skies and internal tension. Elena sat in the jump seat, her headset on, listening. She wasn't listening to the chatter of the pilots or the briefing of the PJ team. She was listening to the engines. To anyone else, the twin Lycoming T-55GA 714A engines sounded like a continuous, deafening roar. To Elena, they were a symphony. She could hear the distinct rhythm of the gas generator turbines, the whine of the power turbine, the subtle mesh of the transmission gears, and she heard it. It was a faint, intermittent chirp, a sound no more significant than a bird hitting a window buried under 100 decibels of noise. It happened when the pilot, a cocky captain named Reed who took his cues from Thorne, adjusted the torque for a climb. "Number 2 is surging," Elena said into the comms. Her voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline-fueled talk of the rescue jumpers in the back. "Negative, Chief," Reed's voice came back, sounding bored. "Gauges are green across the board. EGT is stable. Torque is matched. You're hearing things again." "Check the vibration suite on the MFD," Elena pressed, her eyes fixed on the back of Reed's helmet. "The 4th stage of the compressor is fluttering. I can feel it in the floorboards." "Vibe levels are within limits, Vance," Thorne's voice cut in. He was sitting in the cockpit's observer seat, overseeing the mission personally. "Keep the comms clear for mission-essential traffic. We're 10 minutes out from the drop zone." Elena leaned back, her hands gripping the edges of her seat. The floorboards were indeed vibrating, a high-frequency shudder that traveled through the soles of her boots and into her bones. It was a subtle thing, like the purr of a cat with a broken rib. She looked out the small, circular window. Below them, the North Cascades were a jagged, terrifying landscape of white and black. Peaks like broken teeth rose out of the clouds, and the wind was beginning to whip the snow into long, ghostly streamers. The mission was simple on paper. Hover over the crash site of the drone, winch Elena and 2 PJs down to secure the array, lift it out, and be gone before the storm turned the mountains into a no-fly zone. But paper didn't account for the chirp. As they crossed a ridgeline at 9,000 feet, the chirp turned into a clunk. The entire airframe shuddered violently, the nose pitching up as the flight control system struggled to compensate for a sudden loss of power in the right engine. Alarms began to scream in the cockpit, a dissonant, panicked chorus of engine out and master caution. "Losing number 2, Reed yelled, his voice losing its cockiness in an instant. "Fire light! I've got a fire light on 2. "Suppress it and feather the load," Thorne ordered, but he was a passenger now, a man watching a disaster he had authored. Elena didn't scream, she didn't even flinch. She was already unbuckling her harness, moving toward the rear of the cabin. She knew exactly what had happened. The fatigue fracture had finally given way, the blade disintegrating and turning the engine into a self-consuming grenade. Shrapnel would have sliced through the hydraulic lines. "We're going down." Reed's voice was a frantic staccato. "I can't hold the trim, we're losing the sink shaft." The Chinook began to spin, a slow, sickening rotation as the torque from the remaining engine became impossible to balance without the synchronizing shaft that connected the 2 massive rotors. The mountain wall was rushing up to meet them, a blur of gray rock and blinding white snow. Impact, impact, impact. The crash wasn't a single event. It was a sequence of violent, bone-jarring thefts. The first hit took the rear landing gear and the ramp, tearing them away with the sound of 1,000 car crashes. The second hit was the main fuselage slamming into a steep, snow-covered shelf, a ledge barely wide enough to hold a truck, let alone a 60-foot helicopter. The world turned upside down, a whirlwind of breaking glass, screaming metal, and the sudden, suffocating intrusion of freezing mountain air. Then there was the silence. It was the kind of silence that only exists after a great violence. A ringing, hollow sound that felt like it was pressing against Elena's eardrums. She was hanging upside down, held by a snagged piece of webbing from her vest. Her head throbbed, and something warm and wet was trickling down her temple, but as she blinked the stars out of her vision, her first thought wasn't about her own life. It was about the machine. The Chinook, or what was left of it, was perched precariously on a 60-degree slope. The cockpit was smashed against a rock face, the tail section was gone, and the number 2 engine was a blackened, smoking ruin. Is everyone okay? A voice groaned. It was Mac, one of the PJs. He was slumped against the interior ribs of the cabin, his leg twisted at an angle that made Elena's stomach turn. "Don't move, Mac," Elena said, her voice raspy. She unhooked herself, falling the few feet to what was now the floor. The smell of fuel was overpowering now, a thick, sweet stench that promised an explosion if a single spark found its way home. "We have to get out. Now. The fuel cells are ruptured." She scrambled toward the cockpit. Reed was slumped over the controls, unconscious or dead, she couldn't tell. Thorne was struggling with his harness, his face pale and his hands shaking. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed animal terror of a man who realized he was no longer in charge of anything. "Help me," Thorne hissed, his fingers fumbling with the release. "Vance, help me." Elena reached out, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She used her wire cutters to snip the jammed webbing, hauling the colonel out of the seat. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. The wreckage spoke for her. They dragged Reed and Mac out of the carcass of the bird, hauling them 30 yards up the slope into the shelter of a rock outcropping. The wind was howling now, a physical force that tore at their flight suits and froze the breath in their lungs. Elena looked back at the Chinook. It was a broken bird, its night stalker markings obscured by soot and snow. In the distance, through the swirling whiteout, she saw the lights of the second Chinook, 403. It was hovering a few hundred yards away, unable to get closer because of the sheer cliff face and the treacherous, unpredictable thermal currents created by the storm. "They're here," Thorne panted, clutching a bruised rib. He looked at the radio on his vest, but it was smashed. "They'll see us. They'll come down." Elena watched the lights of 403. She saw the way the pilot was struggling to keep the bird level. She saw the searchlight beam sweeping the mountainside, barely penetrating the curtain of snow. And then she saw something else. Smoke, not from their crash, from 403 starboard engine. "They can't land," Elena whispered. She knew that bird, she knew its maintenance history. If it stayed in this hover, in this thin air with the stress of the storm, its own engines would flame out. It was a sister ship to 402. It had the same batch of turbine blades. Over the roar of the wind, they heard a crackling voice from a handheld radio Mac had managed to pull from his kit. 402, this is 403. We have a visual on the wreckage. We are experiencing emergency power loss on number 1. We cannot descend. The storm is hitting peak velocity. We are being ordered to RTB. Repeat, we are returning to base. We can't. We can't hold the hover." "No." Thorne screamed, lunging for the radio. "You don't leave us. That's an order. Land the damn bird." "Colonel, we're losing the airframe," the voice came back, strained and breaking with static. "If we stay, we all go down. We'll send a ground team when the weather clears. Eat a 48 hours. I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry." The lights of the second Chinook began to fade, the thrum of its rotors swallowed by the scream of the mountain wind. Thorne stood there, the radio falling from his hand into the deep snow. He looked at the empty sky, then at the 2 injured men, and finally at Elena. 48 hours, Mac whispered, his face white with pain. "In this, we won't last 4. Elena looked at the wreckage of the bird she had tried to save. She looked at the mountain, a vertical labyrinth of ice and shadow. She felt the cold biting into her skin, the first stage of a slow, freezing death. But then she felt something else, a strange, quiet clarity. The people who were supposed to lead had failed. The machines they relied on had broken. The rescue they expected had vanished. She reached down and picked up Mac's discarded radio. She checked her watch. It was 0712. "We aren't waiting for ground team," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind like a blade. Thorne looked at her, his eyes hollow. What choice do we have? We're on a ledge at 10,000 feet. We have 2 men who can't walk. We have no heat, no food, and a storm that could bury us in an hour. Elena looked at the Chinook. She saw the auxiliary power unit still mostly intact. She saw the survival kits in the tail. And she saw the path, a narrow, treacherous goat trail that wound down the western face toward a valley where a forestry service cabin sat 6 miles away. She knew that cabin. She had mapped this range a dozen times in her head before the flight. The choice is we stay here and die or we move, Elena said. Move where? Thorne scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning through his fear. You're a mechanic, Vance, not a mountaineer. Elena didn't answer him. She walked toward the wreckage. She didn't need him to believe her. She didn't need his permission. She knew how to build things from nothing. She knew how to make a machine work even when it was broken. And she knew that the only thing more dangerous than a dying engine was a woman who had been told she was seeing ghosts, only to find herself standing in a graveyard. She reached the fuselage and began to tear away the insulation blankets. She would need them for stretchers. She would need the fuel for a signal fire she'd build only when she was ready. She would need the hydraulic fluid to keep the joints of her improvised sleds from freezing. As she worked, the dark competence took over. The world narrowed to the task at hand. The cold became a data point, not a sensation. The fear became a fuel, burned with the same efficiency as the JP-8. Thorne watched her from the rocks, his face a mixture of resentment and dawning realization. He was the commander. He was the one with the eagles on his shoulders. But as Elena Vance began to systematically strip the million-dollar wreckage of its most basic, life-saving components, it was clear that the hierarchy of the army had ended at the ridgeline. Elena stopped for a moment, her breath hitching as she looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted for a brief, cruel second, revealing the distant, retreating silhouette of 403. They were watching her, she knew. They were looking through their thermal optics, seeing the heat signatures of the survivors. They were watching from the safety of the sky as she stood alone in the ruins of their failure. She didn't wave. She didn't signal. She simply reached into her pocket, felt the jagged shard of titanium one last time, and then threw it into the abyss. Mac, get the morphine ready, Elena called out, her voice hard as the ice under her boots. We're leaving, and Colonel, you're going to carry the front of the sled. If you drop it, I'll leave you here with the metal you love so much. She didn't wait for his answer. She stepped back into the broken heart of the machine, a woman who had been left behind, already planning her way back through a world that had forgotten her name. The wind picked up, a high-pitched scream that sounded like a turbine failing. Elena Vance didn't blink. She just started to pull. The first mile was a descent through a nightmare of vertical ice and shifting shale. Elena had fashioned 2 IKEA-style sleds from the Chinook's interior floor panels. They were crude, heavy, and lacked any sort of ergonomic grace, but they slid. She had wrapped Mac and Reed in the thermal insulation blankets, securing them with the very webbing Thorne had once used to strap himself into his command seat. Elena took the lead on Mac's sled, the heavier of the 2. She had the harness looped over her shoulders, the nylon biting through her flight suit and into her collarbones. Every step was a calculated risk. The snow was waist-deep in drifts, concealing shirt holes, deep pockets of air between rocks that could snap an ankle in a heartbeat. Behind her, Thorne was struggling with Reed's sled. He was fit, a man who prided himself on his Army combat fitness test scores, but he lacked the specific, grinding endurance of someone who had spent their life working on their feet. He was already huffing, his face a bright, dangerous red against the whiteout. We need to stop," Thorne gasped, his boots slipping on a patch of black ice. I can't feel my hands." Elena didn't stop, she didn't even look back. If we stop, the core temperature of the casualties drops 5 degrees in 10 minutes. If that happens, Mac goes into shock and his heart stops. Do you want to explain to his wife why you needed a breather, Colonel? Her voice was a lash. She was using the same tone she used when a junior mechanic tried to shortcut a safety check. It was a voice that brooked no argument because it was backed by the absolute authority of the situation. You're being insubordinate, Chief," Thorne spat, though the words lacked their usual venom. They were the desperate reflex of a man losing his grip on the world. "The UCMJ doesn't cover survival at 10,000 feet, sir," Elena said, her eyes fixed on a distant stand of subalpine fur. "Out here, the only rank that matters is who can keep the blood moving. Now pull." She felt a surge of controlled rage. This man had ignored her warning. He had risked the lives of 15 men for a piece of hardware that was currently sitting in 1,000,000 pieces at the bottom of a crevasse. And now, even as she was dragging his broken mission out of the grave, he was worried about the propriety of her tone. She adjusted the harness. Her shoulders were screaming, a dull, throbbing ache that she pushed into a corner of her mind. She thought about Oregon, about the time her father's tow truck had broken down in a blizzard on the Santiam Pass. He had made her stay in the cab while he walked 3 miles to a ranger station. When he came back, his ears were white with frostbite, but he was smiling. "The machine failed, Elle," he'd said, "but the person didn't. Remember the difference." She remembered. As they reached a narrow saddle between 2 peaks, the wind suddenly died down, replaced by a silence so profound it was terrifying. The mountain wave had passed, but Elena knew what came next. The eye of the storm. In 20 minutes, the real snow would start, the heavy, wet Pacific cement that would make the sleds impossible to move. "Check their vitals," Elena ordered. She dropped her harness and knelt by Mac. The PJ was conscious, but his eyes were glassy. The morphine was wearing off, and the cold was beginning to win the battle for his extremities. "Hey, Chief," Mac whispered, his breath a faint puff of gray. You always were the smartest person in the hangar. I should have bet on you." "Save your breath, Mac," Elena said, her fingers moving over his neck to find a pulse. It was thready, but there. "I'm not the smartest. I'm just the one who listens to the noise. Now I need you to stay with me. We're almost to the tree line." "Liars," Mac murmured, a ghost of a smile on his cracked lips. "You always tell the casualties they're almost there." "I don't lie, Mac, you know that. Machines don't lie, and neither do I." She stood up and looked at Thorne. He was slumped over the other sled, his head in his hands. He looked broken, not just physically, but fundamentally. The structure of his life, the orders, the respect, the certainty of his position, had been stripped away, and there was nothing underneath. "The satellite array," Thorne said suddenly, looking up. His eyes were wide, darting toward the wreckage they had left behind. "The recovery package, it's still in the fuselage if the ground team doesn't find it." Elena stared at him. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The sheer, blinding idiocy of the comment felt like a physical blow. "Colonel, we have 2 men dying of hypothermia and a storm that's going to bury this mountain in 6 feet of snow, and you're worried about a box of sensors." "It's the mission, Vance. It's the entire reason we're here. The mission is over." Elena roared, the sound echoing off the rock walls. "The mission failed the second you ignored the red X on that maintenance log. Right now, the only mission is getting these men to that cabin. If you mention that array one more time, I will unhook your sled and you can go back for it yourself. Do you understand me?" Thorne flinched. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as a subordinate, not as a woman, but as a predator, something that had evolved to survive in this specific, brutal environment while he was still trying to use a rulebook that had been burned in the crash. I understand," he whispered. "Good, then get up. The trees are half a mile down. Once we get into the timber, the wind will break. We can build a fire." They started again. The descent became steeper, the sleds wanting to run away from them. Elena had to wrap the tow lines around her waist, using her body as a brake, her boots digging into the crust of the snow. Every few feet she would slip, her knees slamming into the frozen ground, but she got back up. She didn't have a choice. The first tree they reached was a stunted, wind-blown hemlock. To Elena, it looked like a cathedral. As they moved deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to rise a fraction of a degree, and the screaming of the wind faded to a muffled roar in the canopy above. But the Pacific cement had arrived. Heavy, wet flakes began to fall, so thick they obscured the person 5 feet in front of them. The sleds, which had slid so easily on the ice, were now dragging through the slush like they were filled with lead. I can't move it," Thorne sobbed. He had fallen for the 10th time, and this time he didn't get up. He lay in the slush, his chest heaving. "It's too heavy, Vance, please, we have to stop." Elena looked at him. She felt no pity, only a cold, clinical assessment of his utility. He was done. He had hit his limit. If she pushed him any further, he'd become a 3rd casualty she'd have to drag. "Stay here," she said. "What? You're leaving me?" "I'm going to scout the trail. There should be a drainage creek about 200 yards ahead. If I can find it, we can use the frozen bed to move faster. Stay with the sleds. If you hear a whistle, you answer it. Do you hear me?" She didn't wait for his confirmation. She disappeared into the whiteout. She was alone now, truly alone. The forest was a maze of gray trunks and white silence. Her legs felt like they were made of wood, and her vision was starting to tunnel. This was the point where the mind usually started to play tricks. She thought she heard the sound of rotors. She thought she heard her father's voice. She thought she heard Socket barking at a squirrel in the yard, but she pushed it all away. She focused on the noise. She listened for the sound of running water under the ice. She looked for the lean of the land. She found the creek. It was a narrow ribbon of white tucked between two steep banks. She tested the ice with her heel. It was solid. She turned to head back to the group, but as she did, she saw something that stopped her heart. A light, not a flashlight, not a signal fire, a blue-white glow hovering in the trees about 100 yards away. It was a thermal imaging beam. The ground team, no, it was too early. It had only been 4 hours since the crash. The radio had said 48. Elena dropped into a crouch, her hand instinctively going to the survival knife on her vest. She watched the light. It was moving systematically, sweeping the forest floor, and then she heard the voices. They weren't American. The realization hit her with the force of a landslide. Thorne had been right about one thing: the array was valuable, but he had been wrong about who would get there first. These weren't Russians or Chinese. They were a specialized, deniable recovery team, probably launched from a nearby civilian vessel off the coast the moment the drone went down. They had been tracking the Chinook, and they hadn't come for the survivors. They had come for the box. And in their world, survivors were just witnesses. Elena stayed perfectly still. She watched 3 figures emerge from the gloom. They were dressed in white winter camouflage, carrying suppressed carbines. They moved with a professional, lethal grace. They were headed toward the crash site, up the very trail she had just carved into the snow. If they kept going, they would find Thorne and the injured men in 10 minutes. Elena looked back toward the creek. She could run. She could disappear into the timber, find the cabin, and maybe survive. But Thorne couldn't move. Mac and Reed were helpless. She thought about the G-model Chinook, about the piece of titanium in her pocket, about the way the army had dismissed her, then left her to die. She owed Thorne nothing. She owed the mission nothing. But she looked at the deniable team again. She saw the way they handled their weapons. They weren't soldiers. They were scavengers. Elena Vance didn't have a rifle. She had a survival knife, a roll of 550 cord, and a flare gun with 2 rounds. She had a body that was failing and a mind that was screaming for sleep. But she also had the machine. She remembered the auxiliary power unit, a POO, on the Chinook. She remembered the way it was perched on the edge of that 60-degree slope, and she remembered the chirp of the No. 2 engine. She didn't head back to Thorne. She turned and began to climb. She moved like a ghost, using the shadows of the trees and the roar of the wind to mask her movement. She wasn't dragging a sled now, and the adrenaline was acting like a high-octane fuel. She reached the ridgeline in 20 minutes, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The crash site was silent. The wreck of 402 looked like a whale carcass on a beach. Elena reached the fuselage. She didn't go for the survival kits. She went for the engine bay. She knew these machines better than anyone alive. She knew that if she bypassed the safety interlocks on the APU and flooded the intake with the remaining hydraulic fluid, she could create a thermal runaway. It wouldn't just be a fire. It would be an explosion, a magnesium-white flare that would be visible for 50 miles, even through a storm. But more importantly, it would vibrate. The wreck was balanced on a knife edge of shale and ice. The only thing keeping it from sliding down the 3,000-foot deadfall on the other side of the ridge was the friction of its own weight, if she could induce a high-frequency vibration in the frame. She worked with a feverish, desperate precision. Her fingers were numb, but the muscle memory was absolute. She bypassed the solenoids. She rerouted the fuel lines. She could hear the deniable team now. They were close, maybe 200 yards down the trail. She heard a muffled shout in a language she didn't recognize. She finished the bypass. She had one chance to trigger the igniter. "Vance!" She froze. It was Thorne. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of exhaustion and confusion. He had followed her. "What are you doing?" he hissed, stumbling toward her. "Why did you come back? Where are the others?" "Get back, Colonel." Elena yelled, her hand on the APU toggle. "Get behind the rock." "The array," Thorne muttered, his eyes fixed on the fuselage. "You came back for the array. I knew it. I knew you were a soldier, Vance." He lunged for the door of the Chinook. "No!" Elena flipped the toggle. The APU didn't roar, it shrieked. A high, piercing wail that sounded like a soul being torn apart. The entire airframe began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that shook the snow from the nearby trees. "Get out of there!" Elena screamed, grabbing Thorne by the back of his flight suit and hurling him backward. The vibration reached a crescendo. The shale beneath the wreck groaned, a deep tectonic sound. And then the mountain gave way. The Chinook didn't just slide, it vanished. It tipped over the edge of the cliff, the APU still screaming, and plummeted into the abyss. 5 seconds later, a brilliant, blinding flash lit up the entire ridgeline as the fuel cells ignited. The shockwave knocked Elena and Thorne to the ground, a wall of heat and sound that momentarily silenced the storm. Down the trail, the deniable team stopped. They watched as the prize they had come for, the satellite array, the airframe, the witnesses, was consumed in a pillar of fire at the bottom of a 1,000-foot drop. In their world, a clean recovery was the only goal. Now there was nothing but a burning hole in the snow and a signature that every radar in the Pacific Northwest would have picked up. They didn't stay to investigate. They vanished back into the whiteout, ghosts returning to the sea. Elena lay in the snow, her ears ringing, her vision swimming in colors that didn't exist. She felt a hand on her shoulder. You destroyed it," Thorne whispered. He wasn't angry, he sounded awestruck. "You destroyed the mission." Elena looked at him. She saw the fire reflecting in his eyes. She saw the man who had left her to die and the man she had just saved twice. "No, Colonel," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "I fixed the machine. It was broken. Now it's gone." She stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against a tree. She looked toward the valley. The fire would bring the real search teams. The Coast Guard, the Air Force, the SAR units from Lewis McChord. They would be here in an hour. "Mac and Reed are waiting," Elena said. She started down the mountain for the last time. She didn't look back at the fire. She didn't look back at the wreck. She just focused on the next step, because she was Elena Vance. She was a maintenance test pilot. She knew that when a component failed, you replaced it. And when a world failed, you built a new one breath at a time, until you finally found your way home. The first search helicopter, an HH-60 Pave Hawk, broke through the clouds just as they reached the frozen creek. Elena watched its lights, the twin rotors cutting through the snow like a promise. She sat down on the ice, pulled a small, scruffy terrier mix's leash from her pocket, the one she'd forgotten to leave on the counter, and closed her eyes. The machine was finally silent. The rotor wash of the HH-60 Pave Hawk was a violent, screaming resurrection that tore the silence of the North Cascades into 1,000 jagged pieces. Elena Vance didn't shield her eyes from the stinging spray of ice and pulverized snow. She watched the rescue bird descend like a predator claiming a kill it hadn't earned. The downwash flattened the subalpine firs, and for a moment the world was nothing but blinding white light and the rhythmic, guttural throb of twin T-700 engines. It was a familiar sound, a healthy sound, but to Elena it felt like an intrusion. The mountain had been honest in its brutality. The machine now hovering above her was a complicated lie, built by committees and maintained by people who didn't understand the cost of a single metal shard. 2 pararescue men dropped from the hoist before the wheels even touched the frozen creek bed. They moved with the frantic, high-energy precision of men who expected to find corpses. When they found Elena sitting on the ice, her back against a rock, holding a dog's leash in one hand and a flare gun in the other, they slowed down. It was the controlled look in her eyes that stopped them. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't weeping. She was waiting, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the Chinook at the bottom of the ravine, her mind already calculating the torque requirements of the recovery crane that would eventually have to haul that $1 million mistake out of the hole. "Chief!" One of the PJs shouted over the roar, his voice muffled by his flight helmet. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering over her shoulders as if she might shatter. "Chief Vance, can you hear me?" Elena looked at him, her eyes tracking the name tape on his vest, Miller. She didn't answer immediately. She was listening to his bird. The #1 engine on the Pave Hawk had a slight vibratory oscillation in the transition section. It was faint, a 3 Hz shudder that most pilots would ignore, but it set her teeth on edge. "Mac has a compound fracture of the femur and stage 2 hypothermia," Elena said, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Captain Reed is head trauma symptomatic, likely a grade 3 concussion. Colonel Thorne is mobile but in shock. Prioritize the casualties. I'm fine." Miller stared at her for a heartbeat, then signaled his partner toward the sleds. He tried to help her up, but Elena pushed his hand away. She stood on her own, her legs feeling like they were made of rusted rebar, and watched as they loaded Mac onto the hoist. Mac caught her eye as he was lifted, a brief, silent acknowledgement of the debt he couldn't yet articulate. Then she turned to Thorne. The colonel was standing 10 feet away, watching the wreckage burn. He looked small. The eagles on his shoulders seemed to have lost their weight, his posture sagging under the realization that the high-value package was now a molten puddle of classified silicon and titanium. The flight to Joint Base Lewis McChord was a 40-minute blur of sterile cabin light and the metallic tang of emergency medical kits. Elena sat on the floor of the pave hawk, refusing a seat, her eyes fixed on the vibration dampener in the ceiling. She didn't talk to the crew. She didn't ask for a blanket. She simply existed in the space between the crash and the consequence. She knew what was coming. In the Army, when a high-value asset was destroyed, the system looked for a narrative. And if the narrative didn't involve a convenient hero, it looked for a convenient ghost. They landed at Madigan Army Medical Center under a canopy of rain that felt like a personal insult after the purity of the mountain snow. The transition from the wilderness to the institutional machine was jarring. The smell of floor wax and antiseptic, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the blinding fluorescent hum of the emergency room. Elena was processed, poked, and prodded by a series of captains and majors who treated her like a specimen. They found the laceration on her temple, the deep bruising on her ribs, and the localized frostbite on her fingertips. They gave her a gown that smelled of industrial bleach and told her to wait. She waited for 6 hours in a room that felt like a sensory deprivation tank. No windows, no clock, just the distant sound of a television in the hallway and the occasional chime of the PA system. She spent the time mentally reassembling the number 2 engine of 402. She traced the path of the titanium shard through the compressor stages, visualizing the exact moment the harmonic imbalance had exceeded the structural integrity of the main shaft. She knew the fault wasn't hers. She knew she had warned them. But in the quiet of Hangar 3 at Fort Campbell, the truth was a technical manual. Here in the belly of the command structure, truth was a negotiable commodity. The door opened at 04:00 on Wednesday morning. It wasn't a doctor. It was a man in a charcoal suit with the kind of haircut that suggested a recent departure from the 75th Ranger Regiment. He carried a leather-bound folder and a cup of lukewarm coffee that he didn't offer her. "Chief Vance," he said, pulling a chair across the floor with a screech that made Elena's jaw tighten. "I'm Special Agent Miller with CID. We need to talk about the destruction of the surveillance array." Elena sat up, the thin paper of the hospital gown crinkling. She didn't look at the folder. She looked at the bridge of his nose. "I'd rather talk about the fatigue fracture in the T-55GA 714A engine. That's why the bird is in the hole, Agent Miller. The array is just gravity doing its job." Miller didn't blink. He opened the folder, revealing a series of high-resolution satellite photos taken an hour after the rescue. They showed the charred remains of the Chinook. "Colonel Thorne's initial statement says you intentionally triggered a thermal runaway in the APU. He says you bypassed the safety interlocks and used hydraulic fluid as an accelerant. He says he ordered you to secure the package, and you, how did he put it? You scuttled the mission." The dark competence Elena had relied on to survive the mountain flared into a cold, precise anger. She didn't let it reach her face. She let it sharpen her mind. "Colonel Thorne's statement is technically accurate but contextually fraudulent. I induced the runaway to create a thermal signature for the SAR birds and to trigger a landslide that would prevent a hostile recovery team from seizing the technology. If I hadn't destroyed it, the array would be on a boat to Vladivostok right now." Miller leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "A hostile recovery team? Chief, the radar logs for the entire Pacific Northwest are clean. There were no unauthorized aircraft in that sector. No ground signatures. Search and rescue didn't see anyone. Colonel Thorne says you were suffering from hypoxia and acute stress. He says you were seeing ghosts in the trees." Elena felt the gap opening, the wide, yawning chasm between what had happened on that ridge and what the Army was willing to admit. If they acknowledged a foreign team was on the ground, it meant a massive intelligence failure. It meant the mission was compromised before it even launched. But if they blamed a stressed female pilot for a catastrophic loss of equipment, the paperwork stayed neat. The careers stayed intact. "I wasn't seeing ghosts," Elena said, her voice flat. "They were wearing white winter camis, they had suppressed carbines, they were professional, and they were less than 200 yards from our position. I saved the colonel's life and the lives of 2 injured PJs by denying the enemy their objective. If Thorne wants to call that hallucination, he's doing it to cover the fact that he sat in the snow and cried while I did his job." Miller sighed, a sound of practiced disappointment. "Thorne is a decorated officer with 20 years of service, Vance. You're a maintenance pilot with a history of, let's call it procedural friction. You've got 3 letters of reprimand for refusing to sign off on airframes that your commanders deemed mission capable. You have a reputation for being difficult." "I have a reputation for being right," Elena corrected him. The airframes I refused to sign were death traps. One of them crashed in the Mojave 6 months after I was transferred. 2 pilots died. Check the serial numbers. I'll wait. Miller didn't check. He closed the folder. The general is coming in this morning. He's not interested in serial numbers. He's interested in why a $20 million piece of hardware is a pile of ash because a chief warrant officer decided to play commando. You're being placed on administrative hold, Vance. Don't leave the base. Don't talk to the press. And for God's sake, don't talk to the PJs. He left the room without another word. Elena sat in the silence, the hum of the hospital returning to fill the void. She felt the weight of the institution pressing down on her, the slow, grinding machinery of a system that valued the appearance of success over the reality of survival. She knew she should be scared. She was facing a court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and potentially prison time for the destruction of government property. But she wasn't scared. She was calculating. She waited until the shift changed at 0700. The hospital was a labyrinth of routines, and routines were just systems with predictable flaws. She found her clothes in a plastic bag in the closet. Her flight suit was ruined, but her boots were still solid, the dried blood on the laces a dark copper crust. She dressed quickly, her movements efficient and silent. She didn't have her ID, Miller had taken it, but she had something better. She had the key to the maintenance locker she'd been assigned when they arrived. She slipped out of the room and headed toward the ICU. She didn't use the main elevators. She used the service stairs, the cold concrete of the stairwell a relief after the carpeted halls. She found Mac's room on the 4th floor. There was a guard at the door, a young MP who looked like he was dreaming of a breakfast burrito. Elena didn't try to sneak past him. She walked up to him with the absolute, unshakable authority of a woman who belonged there. "Private," she said, her voice sharp. "Chief Vance, 160th. I'm here for the technical debrief on the casualties equipment. Move." The MP blinked, his brain struggling to reconcile her disheveled appearance with the command in her voice. He looked at her boots, then at the bruised, swollen side of her face. He didn't ask for an ID. He didn't ask for a name on a list. He saw the dark competence, and he stepped aside. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Elena entered the room. Mac was hooked up to a dozen monitors, his legs suspended in a complex traction rig. He looked pale, but his eyes were open, watching the door. When he saw her, the tension in his jaw relaxed just a fraction. "Chief," he whispered, the word hitching in his throat. I heard they're trying to pin the burn on you." Elena moved to the side of his bed. She didn't touch him. She didn't offer a platitude. She just stood there, a steady presence in the flickering light of the monitors. "Thorne is rewriting the script, Mac. He needs the array to be a lost opportunity caused by my mental break. He can't afford for it to be a narrow escape from a foreign hit team." Mac tried to sit up, a grimace of pain twisting his features. "I saw them, Elena, through the whiteout, just for a second. I saw the IR strobes on their helmets. They weren't ours. Our strobes pulse at a different frequency." Elena leaned in, her heart skipping a beat. This was it, the technical detail that the ghost narrative couldn't explain. "You're sure the frequency was off?" "It was high," Mac said, his voice fading. "Maybe 800 hertz. Ours are capped at 600 to avoid interference with the new HUDs. I thought I was dreaming it, but I saw the pulse." "Did you tell CID?" "They haven't talked to me yet. Some guy in a suit came by, told the doctors I was too drugged up for a statement. They're icing me out, Elena." Elena felt a surge of loyalty so intense it was almost physical. Mac was risking his career just by talking to her. He was a PJ, a Tier 1 asset, and he was being sidelined because his truth didn't fit the Colonel's PowerPoint presentation. "I need your kit, Mac," Elena said. "The tactical data recorder in your vest. If it was active during the descent, it might have captured the strobe frequency on the peripheral sensors." "The CID took my vest," Mac said, his eyes darkening. "But they didn't take my watch. It's in the plastic bin under the bed. It's a Garmin mark. I had the tactical mode on. It logs ambient electromagnetic signatures to help with signal jamming detection." Elena knelt, her fingers finding the plastic bin. She dug through his blood-stained uniform, his boots, his shattered sunglasses until she found the watch. It was a rugged, blacked-out piece of hardware, the screen cracked but the casing intact. She tucked it into the pocket of her flight suit. "They're going to come for you, Elena," Max said, his voice a warning. "Thorne isn't just protecting himself, he's protecting the contract. That drone array? It wasn't just a sensor. It was a prototype for the new integrated battle command system. If it's proven that a foreign team almost walked away with it because of a maintenance failure on a 160th bird, the manufacturer loses a $4 billion deal. Thorne is on the board of the consultancy firm that vetted the drone. He's not just a colonel, he's a shareholder. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a betrayal that went deeper than Elena had imagined. It wasn't just ego, it was money, the most American of motives. The institution wasn't failing, it was working exactly as intended to protect the profit margin of the military-industrial complex at the expense of the people who actually bled for it. "I'll get the data, Mac," Elena said. "Rest, don't tell them we talked." She left the room as quietly as she had entered. She didn't go back to her room. She walked out of the hospital's side entrance, the cold Washington rain hitting her face like a slap. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a phone, but she had a destination. There was a small, off-base workshop in Tacoma, a place run by a retired warrant officer named Greasy Pete who specialized in rebuilding vintage motorcycles and untraceable electronics. Elena had spent half her weekends there, helping Pete with his CNC machine in exchange for the use of his logic analyzer. It was 3 miles away. She started walking. She walked through the gray morning, her boots rhythmically striking the pavement. Her body screamed for sleep, her ribs throbbed with every breath, but she didn't slow down. She was a woman defined by what she did under pressure, and right now the pressure was at a critical limit. She thought about Socket. She thought about her father's scrapyard. She thought about the way a machine spoke to you if you were patient enough to listen. The watch in her pocket felt like a live coal. If Mac was right, that data was the only thing standing between her and a prison cell. But more importantly, it was the only thing that could force the system to acknowledge the truth. She reached Pete's shop at 09:30. The smell of old oil and welding sparks greeted her before she even crossed the threshold. Pete was at his bench, a magnifying glass clipped to his glasses, dissecting the carburetor of a 1974 shovel head. He didn't look up when the door opened. "We're closed, kid. Come back when the sun's out." "The sun's never out in Tacoma, Pete," Elena said. Pete froze. He looked up, his eyes widening behind the thick lenses. He took in her bruised face, the ruined flight suit, the hollow look in her eyes. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood up and pointed toward the back room where the high-end servers and the oscilloscope sat under a layer of dust. "Coffee's in the pot," he said. "The analyzer is calibrated. Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it before the people chasing you do." "Thanks, Pete." "Don't thank me yet. I saw the news. A Chinook went down in the Cascades yesterday. They're saying it was pilot error. That's a hell of a thing to say about a night stalker." "They're saying a lot of things," Elena said, moving toward the back. "Most of them are lies." She spent the next 4 hours submerged in the digital architecture of Mac's watch. It was a painstaking, microscopic process. She had to bypass the encryption, then sift through thousands of lines of metadata, GPS coordinates, heart rate, barometric pressure. She was looking for the EM log. The dark competence took over. The world narrowed to the green glow of the monitor. She felt the specific physical tension of a person who knows the clock is ticking. At any moment, the MP who let her into Mac's room would realize his mistake. CID would track her location through her lack of presence at the hospital. Thorne would be making his move. And then she found it. A spike. 812 hertz. It appeared exactly 6 minutes after the crash and persisted for 22 minutes. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It wasn't a glitch. It was a rhythmic, pulsing signature that moved in a 360-degree sweep around the crash site. "Got you," Elena whispered. She cross-referenced the signature with a leaked database of international tactical signals she'd acquired months ago for research. The result was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The frequency belonged to a specialized recovery and sanitization unit operated by a private military contractor based out of Singapore, a company known for doing the dirty work for whoever had the deepest pockets. They hadn't been there to steal the array for a foreign power. They had been there to sanitize the site on behalf of the manufacturer, to ensure that the evidence of the engine failure, the very shard of titanium Elena had found, was destroyed before an independent investigation could take place. Thorne wasn't just covering up an intelligence failure. He was protecting a corporate assassination of the truth. He had sent those men to the mountain to ensure that 402 Heart Murmur stayed a secret, even if it meant the crew died in the process. The realization was a physical weight, a sickening clarity that made the room feel too small. Elena leaned back, her hands shaking. She wasn't just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting a conspiracy that reached from the cockpit of a Chinook to the boardrooms of D.C. "Find it?" Pete asked, leaning in the doorway. "I found it," Elena said, "but I don't think I can win this one with a wrench, Pete." "You never win these with a wrench, kid. You win them with leverage." Elena looked at the screen. Leverage. She had the data, but who would believe her? CID was already in Thorne's pocket. The general was a politician in a uniform. She needed someone outside the chain of command, someone who saw the machine for what it was. She thought about the G-model Chinook. There was a second bird, 403, the one that had turned back. The pilot, Captain Reed's wingman, a guy named Styx Halloway. He had been the one on the radio, sounding like he was about to cry because he was being ordered to leave his friends behind. He had seen the smoke in his own engine. He had felt the same chirp that Elena had warned them about. If she could get to 403, if she could pull the maintenance logs from its onboard computer before they were purged, she would have the proof that the entire fleet was compromised. "Pete, I need a ride," Elena said. "Where to?" "The airfield, Hangar 7. Pete looked at her like she was insane. "That's a restricted area, Elena. They'll have guards at every gate. You're a fugitive now." "I'm not a fugitive," Elena said, her voice hard as the titanium shard. "I'm the only one who knows how to fix the machine, and right now the machine is trying to kill everyone who flies it." They left the shop in Pete's battered Ford F-150. The drive to the base was a tense, silent journey through the rain-slicked streets of Tacoma. Elena watched the world through the window, the ordinary people going about their lives, the coffee shops, the car washes, and felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was part of a different world, a world of high-stakes failures and classified betrayals, a world where a piece of metal the size of a thumbnail could end a life and start a war. As they approached the main gate of JBLM, Elena saw the increased security. 2 armored Humvees were parked near the barriers, and the MPs were checking IDs with a level of scrutiny that wasn't standard for a Wednesday afternoon. "They're looking for you, kid," Pete said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "They're looking for a woman in a flight suit," Elena said. She looked at the floor of the truck, finding an old, grease-stained Carhartt jacket and a baseball cap Pete used for yard work. She put them on, tucking her hair under the cap and smearing a bit of engine grease across her cheek. "Pull into the civilian contractor lane," Elena directed. "The one for the HVAC crews. They're doing a retrofit on the barracks near the flight line. They won't check as hard." Pete did as he was told. The MP at the contractor gate was a kid, no older than 19, his face wet with rain. He looked at Pete's ID, then at Elena, who was slumped in the passenger seat, staring at a clipboard she'd found on the dashboard. "Company?" the MP asked. "Western Mechanical," Pete said, his voice a perfect imitation of a bored tradesman. "We're here for the boiler in Building 42. It's been acting up since the storm." The MP glanced at the clipboard, then back at Pete. He seemed to hesitate, his eyes lingering on Elena's bruised face. For a second, the world stood still. Elena could hear the idle of the truck's engine, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers, the distant roar of a jet taking off. She felt the dark competence ready to spring, the decision already made that she wouldn't go quietly. Then the MP nodded. "Drive through, watch your speed on the taxiway." They were in. Elena directed Pete through the maze of barracks and warehouses until they reached the perimeter fence of the flight line. Hangar 7 was a massive, corrugated steel structure at the far end of the tarmac, its doors closed against the rain. 403 was inside. She knew it was. The maintenance schedule had it listed for a post-mission inspection that morning. "Drop me here," Elena said, her hand on the door handle. "Elena," Pete said, his voice soft. "If you get caught in there, they won't just discharge you, they'll bury you." "They already tried to bury me on that mountain, Pete," Elena said. "I'm just coming back to return the shovel." She slipped out of the truck and moved like a shadow along the fence line. The rain was her ally now, obscuring her movement and dampening the sound of her boots. She reached the side door of the hangar, a small steel portal marked with a restricted access sign. She didn't have a key, but she didn't need one. She knew the locking mechanism on these hangars. They were old, heavy, and susceptible to a specific kind of physical bypass. She used a thin strip of aluminum she'd taken from Pete's shop, sliding it into the gap between the door and the frame. She felt for the secondary latch, the click echoing in her fingertips. The door groaned open and she slipped inside. The hangar was cavernous, the air thick with the smell of JP-8 and hydraulic fluid. It was a smell that usually felt like home, but today it felt like a tomb. 403 was there, sitting in the center of the floor, its rotors folded back like the wings of a dead moth. It was surrounded by scaffolding and tool carts, but the hangar was empty. The crews were at lunch. Elena moved toward the bird. She felt a pang of recognition, a physical connection to the machine. She had spent 100 hours on this airframe. She knew every bolt, every wire, every idiosyncrasy of its flight control system. She climbed into the cockpit, the darkness of the cabin a relief. She didn't turn on the lights. She used the small red penlight from her pocket, her fingers finding the maintenance port behind the co-pilot's seat. She plugged the Garmin watch into the system using a custom interface cable she'd cobbled together at Pete's. "Come on," she whispered. "Talk to me." The data began to flow. She wasn't just looking for EM spikes now. She was looking for the black box telemetry, the recorded stresses on the #1 engine during the flight. If she could prove that 403 engine was also failing, it would prove that the entire batch of turbine blades was defective. It would prove that the crash of 402 wasn't an accident or an error. It was an inevitability that Thorne had ignored. The screen flickered, a series of graphs and numbers scrolling past. Elena's eyes tracked the vibration levels. There. At 08:14, just as 403 was approaching the crash site. A massive spike in the fourth stage of the compressor. The same chirp she had heard in 402, she had it. The G model wasn't a breakthrough, it was a failure. Chief Vance. The voice was quiet, echoing in the vast space of the hangar. Elena didn't flinch, she didn't jump. She slowly unplugged the cable, tucked the watch and the cable into her pocket, and turned around. Colonel Thorne was standing at the base of the cockpit ladder. He wasn't wearing his flight suit anymore. He was in his class, a uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming in the dim light. Behind him were 2 MPs, their hands on their holsters. "I have to admit, Vance," Thorne said, his voice almost admiring. "I didn't think you'd be this persistent. Most people, after what you've been through, would be happy just to be alive." "I'm not most people, Colonel," Elena said, stepping down from the cockpit. She stood on the hangar floor, facing him, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm not just alive, I'm informed." Thorne stepped closer, his face inches from hers. The smell of his expensive cologne was a sharp contrast to the grease and sweat on her skin. "What you have is a collection of glitches and hallucinations. What I have is a chain of command, a sworn statement from a captain, and the backing of the Department of Defense. You're done, Elena. You're a broken tool in a system that doesn't have time for repairs." "The system has plenty of time for repairs, Colonel," Elena said, her voice a low, dangerous rumble. "What it doesn't have time for is the truth. You killed those men. Maybe not today and maybe not tomorrow, but every time you send a pilot up in a bird with those blades, you're pulling the trigger." Thorne's jaw tightened. He turned to the MPs. "Take her. Put her in a holding cell. I want her processed for theft of government property and unauthorized access to a restricted area, and find whatever she took from that cockpit." The MPs moved forward. Elena didn't resist. She let them take her arms, let them lead her toward the door. But as she passed Thorne, she leaned in, her voice a whisper that only he could hear. "Mac's watch captured the strobe frequency, Sela's, 812 hertz. I know who was on that mountain, and I know who paid for them to be there." Thorne froze. The confidence in his eyes flickered, replaced by a momentary, naked terror. It was the look of a man who realized the machine he had spent his life building was finally, irrevocably breaking down. "Get her out of here," Thorne hissed. As they led her out of the hangar into the pouring rain, Elena looked up at the gray sky. She felt the weight of the handcuffs, the cold bite of the metal against her wrists. But she also felt the weight of the data in her pocket. She had made her decision. She had crossed the line. She had chosen the truth over the institution, and she knew the cost would be everything. But as she was shoved into the back of the MP vehicle, she saw a familiar sight. Pete's truck was still parked at the end of the road, its headlights flashing once, then twice. A signal. She wasn't alone, and the story wasn't over. The vehicle started to move, the tires splashing through the puddles as they headed toward the brig. Elena leaned her head against the cold glass of the window, her mind already working on the next problem. How to get the data to the one person Thorne couldn't touch. The dark competence was still there, burning like a pilot light in the center of her chest. She had been the most experienced person in the room and treated as the least. She had been trusted and then betrayed. She had made a mistake and was earning it back in blood and data. And as the gates of the holding facility loomed ahead, she felt a strange, quiet sense of hope. The machine had failed, the people had lied, but the truth was like a fatigue fracture. It started small. It was invisible to the naked eye, but once it started, nothing in the world could stop the eventual, spectacular disintegration of the lie. She just had to be there to witness the crash. The MP vehicle came to a stop in front of the windowless concrete block that served as the post's detention center. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a deluge that seemed to be trying to wash the entire base into the Puget Sound. One of the MPs opened her door and hauled her out, his grip unnecessarily tight on her upper arm. "Watch your step, Chief," he said, his tone devoid of the respect her rank usually commanded. Elena didn't look at him. She looked at the building. It was a fortress of bureaucracy, a place where people were processed into paperwork and then forgotten. As they reached the heavy steel door of the intake center, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, its tires screeching on the wet asphalt. Two men in suits, not Army CID, but something else, something sharper, stepped out. They didn't look at the MPs, they looked at Elena. "Chief Vance," one of them asked, his voice a cold, professional clip. "We're with the Office of the Inspector General. We've been looking for you." Elena felt a jolt of adrenaline. The IG, the only body with the authority to bypass Thorne's chain of command. But as she looked at the men, she saw the way their hands rested near their jackets. She saw the way they positioned themselves, blocking her path to the door, blocking the MP's view. She looked at their shoes. They were wearing expensive leather loafers, completely impractical for the Washington weather. They weren't IG. They were the sanitization team, and they weren't here to arrest her. "Run," Elena whispered to the MP holding her arm. "What? Run!" She screamed, throwing her weight backward and slamming her head into the MP's nose. The world exploded into a chaos of gunfire and shattering glass. The first bullet hit the MP vehicle's windshield, a spiderweb of cracks blooming in the center. The second bullet took the second MP in the shoulder, spinning him around like a rag doll. Elena didn't wait. She dove under the vehicle, her handcuffs scraping against the wet pavement. She felt the heat of the rounds hitting the metal above her, the smell of cordite and ozone filling her lungs. This was the escalation. The gap between what she knew and what the system was willing to believe had just been closed by a volley of 56 rounds. She wasn't a maintenance pilot anymore. She was a target. And as she scrambled toward the darkness of the nearby motor pool, she realized with a chilling certainty that the men in the black SUV didn't care about the array, the engines, or the truth. They only cared about one thing. The machine was finally, truly silent, and they intended to keep it that way. The first bullet didn't make a sound, only a sharp, metallic asterisk thwack asterisk as it punched through the side of the MP's transport van. But the second one shattered the passenger window into a million diamonds of safety glass. Elena Vance didn't wait for the third. She threw her weight backward, her center of gravity low and calculated, and slammed her skull into the bridge of the MP's nose. It was a messy, brutal collision of bone and cartilage, the kind of impact that felt like a localized explosion in her own head, but she didn't flinch. She heard the wet crunch of his septum breaking. She felt the immediate spray of hot blood across the back of her neck. As the MP stumbled back, clutching his face, Elena dropped. She didn't run. Running made you a silhouette. She rolled under the chassis of the van, the cold, oil-slicked asphalt of Joint Base Lewis McChord greeting her with the familiar smell of industrial decay and stagnant rainwater. Under the van, the world was a narrow, horizontal strip of chaos. She saw the feet of the men from the black SUV, leather loafers, no tread moving with the rhythmic, terrifying confidence of professionals who didn't expect to be challenged. They weren't soldiers. They were predators in business casual. Another suppressed round struck the pavement inches from her face, kicking up a spray of grit and ancient motor oil. Elena's heart wasn't racing. It was a heavy, rhythmic thrum in her chest, a mechanical pulse that mirrored the idle of the nearby generator. She reached for the MP's leg, her fingers finding the heavy, polymer holster on his hip. She didn't pull the gun. She didn't want a shootout she couldn't win. She felt for the spare cuff key she knew every MP kept tucked behind the mag pouch. Her fingers, numbed by the Washington cold and the shock of the mountain, moved with a terrifying, microscopic precision. She found it, a small, cold sliver of steel. She didn't try to unlock the cuffs yet. There wasn't time. She scrambled out from the opposite side of the van, staying low, using the bulk of the vehicle as a shield. The MP she'd headbutted was on the ground, groaning, his service weapon lying 3 feet away in a puddle. Elena ignored the gun. She looked toward the motor pool, a labyrinth of heavy-duty wreckers, HMMWVs, and 5-ton trucks. If she could get into the guts of the base, she could disappear. She was a ghost in the machine, and this base was nothing but a massive, interconnected machine. "Target is mobile, west side of the transport," a voice shouted. It wasn't a command, it was a status update. Elena lunged for the shadow of a M1088 tractor truck. A bullet sparked off the fuel tank, the sound of the impact a high-pitched asterisk ping asterisk that vibrated in her teeth. She hit the ground behind the rear duals, the smell of heavy-duty rubber and wet mud filling her nose. She finally jammed the key into the cuff lock. One click, two. Her hands were free. She didn't throw the cuffs away. She wrapped the chain around her right fist, the steel cold and heavy, a makeshift knuckle duster. She wasn't thinking about the court-martial anymore. She wasn't thinking about Thorne. She was thinking about the torque of a Cummins engine and the fact that the M1088 in front of her had its air lines connected. It was being prepped for a tow. She didn't climb into the cab. She went for the air release valve on the trailer brakes. She pulled the lever. The hiss of escaping air was a scream in the quiet of the rain, a sudden violent venting that masked the sound of her own movement. She ducked under the trailer just as a shadow crossed the front of the truck. One of the men in the suits, the one with the expensive haircut and the suppressed Glock 17, stepped into the gap. He was looking for a woman running. He wasn't looking for a woman who was part of the truck. Elena swung the heavy steel cuffs. She didn't aim for his head, she aimed for the soft tissue of the throat. The chain caught him across the windpipe with a sickening, muffled thud. He didn't scream. He made a sound like a punctured bellows, his hands flying to his neck. Elena followed through, her shoulder driving into his solar plexus, her movements a blur of practiced, dark competence. As he collapsed, she snatched the radio from his belt. She didn't take his gun. A gun meant she was a combatant. A radio meant she had the frequency. She disappeared into the motor pool, weaving through the rows of olive-drab steel. The rain was a deluge now, turning the gravel lot into a shifting sea of gray. She reached the maintenance shed, building 1204. It was a cavernous, corrugated metal structure, used for overnight repairs on the heavy stuff. She slipped through the side door, the interior smelling of welding sparks, WD-40, and the heavy, earthy scent of men who spent 12 hours a day fighting rust. Inside, the lights were low. A single 110-ton crane hung from the ceiling like the skeleton of a prehistoric bird. Elena moved to the tool bench, her eyes scanning the shadows. She needed to shift the odds. She needed to turn the environment into a weapon. Vance, a voice whispered from the darkness. Elena froze. She didn't turn. She reached for a heavy pipe wrench on the bench, her fingers closing around the cold iron. "It's me, it's Mac." She turned slowly. Mac was sitting in a wheelchair near the back of the shed, his leg in a massive white cast, a heavy blanket draped over his shoulders. He looked like he'd crawled there. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. "What are you doing here, Mac? You're supposed to be in the ICU." "I heard the shots," Mac said, his voice a ragged edge of a whisper. "The MP at my door." "He got a call. He left. I knew they were coming for you. Pete called the shop. He's outside the wire, but he's got a scanner. He said there's a sanitization team on site. Black Ops contractors, Elena, not Sid." Elena moved to him, her hand touching his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched anyone with anything other than violence in 48 hours. He was shaking. "You need to get out of here, Mac. If they find you with me, they'll kill you too." "They're already killing me," Mac said, reaching into the folds of the blanket. He pulled out a ruggedized tablet. "I swiped this from the nurse's station on the way out. It's connected to the base's internal Wi-Fi. I've been watching the feeds. They've got the motor pool surrounded, Elena. They're closing the loop. Thorne isn't just trying to arrest you, he's trying to erase you." Elena looked at the tablet. The grain of the security cameras showed the black SUV and 3 other vehicles, dark, nondescript sedans, moving into positions around the shed. They weren't using the base sirens. They weren't using the lights, they were hunting. "The watch," Elena said. "Did you get the data off it?" "I couldn't," Mac said. "The encryption is too deep for this tablet, but I did see something. The signal wasn't just coming from the mountain, it was being relayed through the base. There's a transmitter on Hangar 7. It's been active since 402 went down." The realization hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. The sanitization team wasn't just a cleanup crew, they were the operators. They had caused the failure from within the base, using the telemetry link to override the engine control units. It wasn't a fatigue fracture. It was a remote access assassination of the airframe. "They used the maintenance link," Elena whispered, her voice tight with a controlled, icy rage. "They didn't just ignore the fault, they manufactured it." "They're coming in, Elena," Mac said, his eyes fixed on the tablet. "South side, 2 men, they've got thermals." Elena looked around the shed. This was the moment of maximum pressure. She was trapped in a metal box with a wounded man pursued by professional killers holding the only evidence of a multi-billion-dollar treason. She didn't feel fear. She felt a narrowing of the world, a sharpening of the senses until the only things that existed were the tools in the room and the path to the exit. "Can you crawl?" she asked Mac. "I can move," he said, his jaw set. "Get under the grease pit. There's a drainage pipe that leads to the storm sewers. It's tight, but it'll take you out toward the perimeter fence. Don't stop. Don't look back." "What about you?" Elena looked at the 110-ton crane. She looked at the heavy-duty hydraulic lift. She looked at the rows of oxygen and acetylene tanks lined up against the wall. "I'm going to fix the machine," she said. She helped Mac into the pit, her movements efficient and silent. Once he was clear, she moved. She didn't hide. She worked. She climbed the ladder to the crane's operator cab, her fingers flying over the controls. She knew this crane. She'd spent 3 weeks 3 years ago recalibrating its load sensors. She felt the specific weight of the steel as she engaged the winch. Below her, the south door creaked open. 2 shadows entered, their movements fluid and synchronized. They carried suppressed submachine guns. The long, thin barrels swept in front of them like the antennae of insects. They moved toward the center of the floor, their boots making no sound on the oil-stained concrete. Elena waited. She watched the thermal signature of their bodies on the crane's load monitor screen, 2 bright, orange ghosts in a world of blue. One of the men stopped. He looked up toward the crane. He saw the red light of the operator's console. He raised his weapon. Elena didn't duck. She threw the lever. The crane's massive 6-ton hook didn't just drop. It swung. She'd preset the tension on the lateral cables, creating a pendulum effect that no one without a degree in mechanical engineering could have predicted. The hook swept across the hangar floor with the speed of a wrecking ball, a silent, gray blur in the shadows. It caught the first man at the waist. There was no scream, only a sickening, wet asterisk crunch asterisk as his body was slammed into the side of a 5-ton truck 20 feet away. The second man dove for cover, his suppressed weapon spitting fire toward the crane cab. The bullets sparked off the reinforced glass, but Elena was already out of the chair. She slid down the access cable, the friction burning through her palms, but she didn't let go. She landed on the floor 5 feet from the second man. He swung his weapon around, but she was faster. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew leverage. She grabbed the barrel of the submachine gun, twisting it upward, using the man's own momentum to drive him back against the tool bench. She slammed her elbow into his jaw, then grabbed a heavy 2-foot pry bar from the rack. She didn't use the bar as a club. She jammed it into the gap of his tactical vest, using it as a lever to pin him against the bench. She leaned in, her face inches from his. He was young. He had the cold, vacant eyes of a man who killed for a paycheck. "Who sent you?" she hissed. The man didn't answer. He reached for a knife on his belt. Elena didn't hesitate. She drove her knee into his groin, then slammed his head back against the steel bench. He went limp. She took his weapon, a Sig Sauer MPX. She checked the magazine, full. She didn't want to use it, but she knew the rules had changed. This wasn't a maintenance dispute anymore. This was a war. She heard the roar of an engine outside. The black SUV was coming through the main doors. Elena ran for the back of the shed. She didn't go for the door Mac had used. She went for the electrical room. She knew the base's power grid was centralized, and Building 1204 was a major junction point for the flight line's lighting and security systems. She found the main breaker panel. It was a massive, gray box humming with the power of 40,000 volts. She didn't just flip the switches. She used the pry bar to bridge the gap between the main bus bars. The explosion was a blinding, blue-white flash that turned the world into a negative photograph. The sound was a physical punch to the chest, a thunderclap that shattered the windows of the shed and sent a surge of raw electricity back through the line. The lights went out, not just in the shed, but across the entire southern sector of the base. The security cameras went dark. The electric locks on the gates failed. In the sudden, absolute darkness, Elena moved. She knew this room. She knew every inch of it by touch. She found the emergency exit, a small manual door that led to the alleyway between the sheds. She stepped out into the rain. The base was in a state of sudden, confused paralysis. Soldiers were spilling out of the barracks, their voices raised in shouted questions. The sirens were finally starting to wail, the emergency backup generators kicking in. Elena didn't head for the gate. She headed for Hangar 7. If the transmitter was there, if that was the source of the override signal, she had to destroy it. It was the only way to protect the rest of the fleet. It was the only way to stop Thorne from killing more pilots. She moved through the shadows, a ghost in the rain. Her ribs were a dull, throbbing ache, and her hand was a bloody mess of torn skin and grease, but she didn't feel it. She felt the mission. She felt the loyalty to the men and women who flew these birds, the people who trusted the machine with their lives. She reached Hangar 7. The massive structure was a dark silhouette against the flickering lights of the flight line. There were guards at the main entrance, 4 of them, wearing the same dark gear as the men in the SUV. They weren't soldiers. They were the sanitization team, and they were guarding the evidence. Elena didn't try to go through the front. She went to the roof. She found the external ladder on the north side, the cold steel slick with ice. She climbed, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. Every rung was a battle, every step a reminder of the cost she was paying. She reached the roof, a vast, flat expanse of gravel and tar. In the center of the roof, next to the HVAC units, was a small, tripod-mounted antenna. It was a sophisticated piece of hardware, a phased array transmitter that looked like a miniature version of the one on the mountain. It was humming, a low, sinister vibration that she felt in her marrow. She moved toward it, the pry bar in her hand. "That's far enough, Vance." Thorne was standing by the access hatch. He was holding a pistol, his arm steady, his face a mask of cold, professional disappointment. He wasn't wearing his uniform now. He was in a dark raincoat, his eyes shadowed by the brim of a cap. "You should have stayed in the hospital, Elena," Thorne said. "You could have been a hero, a tragic figure who lost her mind after a crash. We could have given you a medical retirement, a pension, a quiet life in the mountains." "I don't want a quiet life, Silas," Elena said, her voice flat. "I want a life that's true. Truth is a luxury for people who don't have to carry the weight of the world," Thorne said, stepping closer. "This array, this technology, it's the future of American air power. If the world knows it's flawed, if they know it can be compromised, we lose 20 years of progress. We lose the edge." "The edge is made of people, Thorne," Elena said, her grip tightening on the pry bar. "Not silicon. You're killing the people to save the silicon. That's not progress. That's a manufacturing defect." "Step away from the transmitter, Elena. Don't make me do this." "You already did it," she said. She lunged. Not for him. For the transmitter, Thorne fired. The bullet grazed her shoulder, a searing line of fire that tore through her flight suit and the skin beneath. She didn't stop. She swung the pry bar with everything she had, the heavy steel smashing into the base of the antenna. The transmitter didn't just break. It exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered plastic. The humming stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of the rain and the distant wail of sirens. Thorne fired again, the round hitting her in the side. Elena fell, the world spinning, the cold gravel pressing against her face. She felt the heat of her own blood soaking into her suit, the specific metallic smell of it mixing with the rain. Thorne walked over to her, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. He raised the pistol to her head. "You were always too good at your job, Vance," he whispered. "That was your real mistake." He pulled the trigger, asterisk click, asterisk Thorne blinked. He pulled the trigger again, asterisk click. Asterisk the surge from the electrical room, the massive electromagnetic pulse she'd triggered when she bridged the bus bars. It hadn't just knocked out the lights. It had fried the electronic firing pin in his state-of-the-art service pistol. The machine had finally, truly, failed him. Elena didn't say a word. She used her last ounce of strength to drive the pry bar into Thorne's shin. He yelled in pain, stumbling back, his weapon clattering across the roof. Elena rolled toward the edge of the roof, her body a scream of agony, her vision fading to gray. She didn't look back. She didn't wait to see if he was coming. She slid over the edge, her hands finding the top of a parked fuel truck below. She hit the tank with a jarring thud, then rolled off onto the pavement. She was on the ground. She was bleeding. She was alone, but the transmitter was dead. The link was broken. She crawled toward the darkness of the flight line, her movements slow and agonizing. She found a maintenance locker near the edge of the tarmac, a small steel box used for storing chocks and tie-downs. She dragged herself inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic asterisk drip 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 asterisk of the rain on the metal roof. Elena leaned her back against the cold steel, her hands clutching her side. She felt the Garmin watch in her pocket. The data was still there. The proof. She closed her eyes, the dark competence finally flickering out, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She had done it. She had survived the mountain, the betrayal, and the machine. She didn't know if she would make it through the night. She didn't know if anyone would ever find her. But as she sat in the dark, the smell of jet fuel and rain surrounding her, she felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. She was Elena Vance. She was a maintenance pilot for the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and she had fixed the machine. The hours that followed were a blurred sequence of agonizing sensory inputs. The cold began to seep into her bones, not the clean, biting cold of the mountain, but the damp, invasive chill of a Washington basement. Her breathing was shallow, a wet, rattling sound that she monitored with the detached interest of a mechanic listening to a failing pump. Every few minutes, the base would erupt with the sound of activity, the roar of Humvees, the rhythmic beat of helicopter rotors, the distant, muffled shouting of soldiers. They were looking for her. They were looking for the rogue pilot who had sabotaged the base and attacked the colonel. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was a wreck of torn muscle and shattered pride. She kept her hand on the Garmin watch, her fingers tracing the cracked screen like a rosary. It was the only thing that mattered now. It was the only thing that made the pain worth it. Around 0300, the door to the locker creaked open. Elena didn't open her eyes. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't have any left. She just waited for the end. "Chief!" The voice was soft, hesitant. It wasn't Thorne. It wasn't a contractor. It was a kid. Elena opened her eyes. Standing in the doorway was a young private, no older than 20, wearing a rain-soaked poncho and holding a flashlight. He looked terrified. "Chief Vance," he whispered again. "Is that you?" Elena looked at him, her vision swimming. She recognized the name tape on his chest, *Patterson*. He was the kid from the gate, the one who had let her through with Pete. "Private," she croaked, the word a struggle. "Oh, man," Patterson said, kneeling beside her. You're really messed up, ma'am. The whole base is looking for you. They're saying you're a terrorist. They're saying you killed the MPs." "I didn't." "Kill them," Elena said, her voice a ghost of itself. "The men in the SUV. They did it." Patterson looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the blood. He saw the ruined flight suit. He saw the dark competence that was still there, buried deep under the pain. "I know," he said. "I saw the video before they deleted it. I was in the security office when the power went out. I saw what happened at the intake center." "Why are you here?" I grew up in a town like yours, Chief. My dad was a mechanic. He used to say that you can always tell the quality of a person by the way they treat their tools. You're not a terrorist. You're the person who saved Captain Reed." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside was a field dressing and a bottle of water. He didn't ask permission. He started to clean the wound in her side, his hands shaking but his movements surprisingly steady. "I can't get you out of here, Chief," he said. "The gates are locked down tight. They're checking every vehicle, but I know a place, the old steam tunnels. They run under the flight line to the civilian side of the base." "Mac," Elena said. "Did he make it?" "The PJ? Yeah, he's in a safe house in Tacoma. Pete found him. He's the one who told me where to look for you." Elena felt a surge of hope, a small, flickering flame in the darkness. She wasn't alone. The machine was broken, but the people were still there. "The watch," Elena said, holding it out to him. "Take it. Get it to Pete. Tell him to upload the data to the IG's public server. Don't go through the chain of command. Go around it." Patterson looked at the watch, then back at her. "What about you, Chief?" "I'm going to stay here," she said. "I'm going to wait for them. They'll kill you." "No," Elena said, a faint, bloody smile touching her lips. "They won't. Not after the data is public. After that, I'm the only person who can tell them how to fix the birds. I'm too valuable to kill." Patterson took the watch, his fingers closing around it. He stood up, looking at her with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "Good luck, Chief. Good luck, Private. Watch your six." He disappeared into the rain, the locker door clicking shut behind him. Elena leaned back into the darkness. The pain was still there, a constant, throbbing presence, but it didn't matter anymore. She had done her job. She had fulfilled the mission. She waited. She waited until the first light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the door. She waited until she heard the sound of heavy boots on the tarmac, the rhythmic asterisk crunch 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 asterisk of a tactical team moving in. She waited until the door was kicked open, the blinding light of a dozen flashlights filling the small space. "Hands where we can see them," a voice shouted. Elena didn't move her hands. She kept them folded over her stomach, her fingers interlaced. She looked into the light, her gaze steady, her face a mask of controlled, absolute calm. "Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the small space. "I'm here for my debrief." The soldiers moved in, their weapons trained on her, their faces hidden behind gas masks and tactical helmets. They pulled her out of the locker, their movements rough and impersonal. They threw her onto the wet pavement, pinning her down, the cold rain hitting her face. Thorne walked into the circle of light. He looked tired. He looked old. His leg was in a splint and his face was pale, his eyes filled with a simmering, impotent rage. He looked down at her, his jaw tightening. "Where is it, Elena?" he hissed. "Where's the watch?" Elena looked up at him, the rain washing the blood from her face. She didn't say a word, she just smiled. At that moment, the base's PA system crackled to life. It wasn't the usual morning announcements. It was a recording. It was the sound of the 812 hertz strobe. It was the sound of the override signal. It was the sound of the truth broadcast across the entire base through every speaker into every ear. And then a voice, Pete's voice. "This is the sound of the failure," he said, his voice amplified to a roar. "This is the sound of the betrayal, and this is the proof that Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance was right." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Elena had ever felt. The soldiers looked at each other, their weapons dipping. They looked at Thorne. They looked at the woman on the ground. Thorne turned, his face a mask of absolute, shattering defeat. He knew. He knew the machine was gone. He knew the narrative was dead. He looked back at Elena, his eyes filled with a final, desperate hatred. He raised his foot as if to strike her. "Colonel." The voice came from the edge of the circle. It was a general. A man Elena didn't recognize, but his stars were unmistakable. He was followed by a team of CID agents, real CID agents, wearing their blue jackets and holding their badges. "Step away from the prisoner, Colonel Thorne," the general said, his voice like a gavel. Thorne froze. He slowly lowered his foot. He looked at the general, then back at Elena. "She's a traitor, sir," Thorne said, his voice cracking. "She sabotaged the base. She stole classified data." "We'll determine who the traitor is, Silas," the general said. "Right now, we're more interested in the $4 billion defect you've been hiding." The CID agents moved in. They didn't go for Elena. They went for Thorne. They took his weapon. They took his insignia. They led him away into the gray morning, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. The general walked over to Elena. He didn't help her up. He didn't offer a platitude. He just stood there looking down at her, his face a mask of professional curiosity. "You've caused a lot of trouble, Chief Vance," he said. "I fixed the machine, sir," Elena said. "Yes," the general said, a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I suppose you did." He turned to the medics who were waiting nearby. "Take care of her. She's the only one who knows how to put the fleet back together." Elena felt the hands of the medics on her, the warmth of the blanket they wrapped around her, the sharp prick of the Roman 4 in her arm. She felt the world starting to fade, the exhaustion finally claiming her. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she looked up at the sky. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of pale, blue morning light. She saw a helicopter taking off in the distance, a Black Hawk, its rotors a rhythmic, healthy throb. She listened to the sound, her mind automatically tracking the vibration, the torque, the harmonic balance. It was a good sound, a healthy sound. Elena Vance closed her eyes. She was still standing. She was still Elena, and the machine was finally, truly honest. The reckoning was coming. The trials, the hearings, the long, slow process of rebuilding a shattered career. But that was for tomorrow. Today she had survived. Today she had won. And as the stretcher moved toward the waiting ambulance, Elena felt the small, cold weight of the titanium shard in her pocket. She had kept it. She had held onto the physical proof of the failure. She smiled, a tiny, secret thing that no one else saw. The machine was fixed. But she would never forget the cost. She was a ghost in the system, a woman defined by what she did under pressure. And as she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, she knew that whenever the machine failed again, she would be there. She would always be there, listening, waiting, ready to fix the world one breath at a time. The ceiling of the secure recovery ward at Madigan Army Medical Center had exactly 412 acoustic tiles. And by the third morning, Elena Vance knew which 7 had water damage from the relentless Washington winter. She knew the rhythmic squeak of the floor polisher that passed her door at 02:15, a sound that signaled the deepest part of the night when the hospital held its breath. She knew the specific, mechanical click of the heavy steel door at the end of the hallway, the sound of the guard rotation. She was a woman who lived in the details of machines, and now her own body was the machine she was forced to monitor. It was a failing system of bruised ribs, a jagged entry wound in her side that throbbed with the heat of a slow-burning coal, and a mind that refused to settle into the chemical haze the doctors offered. They had taken her boots first. In the military, your boots are your foundation, the weight that keeps you tethered to the earth, but here they had been replaced by thin, non-slip hospital socks that felt like a surrender. She was dressed in a standard-issue gown that offered no protection and no rank. There were no chevrons here. No master aviator wings, just a plastic wristband with a barcode that identified her as a patient and a prisoner. Two MPs stood outside her door, their shadows stretching across the linoleum like elongated ghosts. They didn't speak to her. They didn't look at her. They were there to ensure that the woman who had brought down a colonel and exposed a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy didn't simply evaporate into the sterile air. The institution's response had been swift, silent, and characteristically cold. The transmission of the 812 Hz signal across the base's PA system had lasted exactly 92 seconds before the signal was jammed, and the servers were wiped. In those 92 seconds, the truth had vibrated through the bones of every soldier on Joint Base Lewis McChord, but the aftermath was being handled with the surgical precision of a PR firm. The official narrative was already shifting. The word sabotage was being replaced by systemic anomaly. The word treason was being replaced by procedural failure. And Elena Vance, the woman who had pulled the curtain back, was being treated as both a star witness and a biohazard. On the fourth afternoon, the door opened with a heavy, deliberate sound that wasn't the nurse or the orderly. It was a man in a charcoal suit, his tie knotted with a mathematical perfection that felt like a threat. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Elena's first car, and he sat in the plastic chair by her bed without asking. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He was the voice of the machine. "The internal bleeding has stopped, Chief Vance. That's good news," he said. His voice was a flat, Midwestern baritone, the kind of voice that delivered layoffs and casualty notifications with the same lack of inflection. "The Army has a significant investment in your training. We'd hate to see it go to waste." Elena didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the water-damaged tile third from the left. "Where is Specialist Mac?" "Mr. Mackenzie is being treated at a private facility. His recovery will be long, but his pension will be generous, provided certain conditions are met." The word *generous* hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a storm. It was a bribe wrapped in a medical update. Elena finally turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were hollow, the skin around them bruised a deep, sickly purple, but the dark competence that had carried her through the mountain and the motor pool was still there, flickering like a pilot light in a dark room. "And Pete?" she asked. "The civilian contractor? His access has been revoked. He's currently being questioned by CID regarding the unauthorized broadcast of classified frequencies. He's facing 12 to 15 years in Leavenworth if we decide to pursue the charges. But again, everything is a choice, Elena." The man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a non-disclosure agreement, but it was more than that. It was an admission of guilt. It stated that the 812 Hz signal was an unauthorized experimental test conducted by Chief Warrant Officer Vance without oversight, and that the subsequent crash of the 402 was the result of unforeseen electronic interference rather than a built-in kill switch. In exchange for signing, Elena would receive an honorable discharge, a full medical retirement, and the permanent sealing of her file. The truth would be buried under a mountain of legalese and a comfortable pension. "Colonel Thorne is in a holding cell at the brig," the man continued, leaning forward. "He's been stripped of his command. We're throwing him to the wolves. He's the villain you wanted. We're giving him to you. All you have to do is sign this and let the rest of it go. The fleet is being upgraded. The sensors are being replaced. The problem is being solved." "You're not solving the problem," Elena said, her voice a dry rasp that hurt her throat. "You're just changing the locks. The software is still there. The back door is still open. You're just hoping the next person who finds it doesn't have a radio." The man in the suit didn't blink. "The world is a dangerous place, Chief. We need the edge. Sometimes the edge has a jagged side. We don't need a maintenance pilot to understand the geopolitics of air superiority. We need her to fix the birds and keep her mouth shut." He left the paper on her overbed table and walked out. The silence that followed was heavier than the morphine. Elena looked at the paper. This was the cost of her loyalty, not her life. They weren't going to kill her. They were going to erase the reason she had almost died. They were going to turn her sacrifice into a clerical error. 6 miles away, in a windowless room in the base's administrative block, the reckoning was happening in a different way. Colonel Silas Thorne sat at a metal table, his hands cuffed to a bar bolted to the floor. He was still in his BDUs, but the Velcro patches where his name and rank had been were ripped away, leaving behind fuzzy, olive-drab scars. He looked smaller than he had on the roof of Hangar 7. The arrogance had leaked out of him, replaced by the stunned, vacant stare of a man who had realized that the institution he had served his entire life was finally done with him. Opposite him sat Major Sarah Halloway of CID. She was a woman who lived in the world of facts, a woman who had spent 10 years investigating fraud and corruption within the ranks. She had a stack of folders in front of her that was 6 inches thick, the telemetry logs from the mountain, the maintenance records Elena had flagged, and the bank statements from a shell company in the Cayman Islands that had been making deposits into a trust fund in Thorne's daughter's name. "You weren't just protecting the tech, Silas," Halloway said, her voice quiet and dangerously calm. "You were protecting the stock price." Aegis Systems saw a 4-point dip when the 402 went down. If the investigation had gone the way Vance wanted, that dip would have been a freefall. They paid you to manage the narrative. They paid you to make sure the defect stayed a mystery. Thorne looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You don't understand the scale of this, Sarah. We're talking about the entire next-gen fleet. If we admitted the flight control system was vulnerable to a specific frequency, we'd have to ground every bird in the theater. We'd be blind for 18 months. I didn't do it for the money. I did it for the mission." "The money says otherwise," Halloway said, sliding a photo across the table. It was a picture of the crash site of the 402, the charred remains of the cockpit, the place where Captain Reed had burned to death because the machine he trusted had been turned against him. "Vance told you the bird was sick. You told her to fly it anyway. Then you tried to kill her when she proved it. That's not a mission, Silas. That's a cover-up." Thorne didn't look at the photo. He couldn't. She was a maintenance pilot. She was supposed to turn wrenches. She wasn't supposed to think. "That was your mistake," Halloway said, standing up. "She's a better soldier than you ever were, because she knew that the most important part of the machine is the person sitting in it. You forgot that, and now the machine is going to chew you up and spit you out." She walked out, leaving Thorne alone in the fluorescent glare. He was a man who had built a career on the idea of controlled risk, and he had finally encountered a risk he couldn't control, a woman who didn't want anything from him, a woman who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and couldn't be broken. Back at Madigan, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange bars across Elena's bed. She had managed to sit up, a process that had taken 10 minutes and left her drenched in a cold sweat. Her side felt like it was being stitched with hot wire, but she was upright. She needed to be upright. A soft knock at the door, not the rhythmic tap of the nurse, a hesitant, uneven sound. "Come in," Elena said. The door pushed open and Mac rolled into the room. He was in a wheelchair, his legs still in a massive cast, his face thin and pale. He wasn't in a private facility. He had bribed an orderly to bring him here, his eyes darting to the MPs at the door who had surprisingly let him pass. He looked at Elena, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. The silence was the sound of everything they had lost. "They told me you were in a coma," Mac whispered. "They told me you were in Tacoma," Elena replied. Mac looked at the non-disclosure agreement sitting on the table. He didn't have to read it to know what it was. He looked back at Elena, his jaw tightening. "Pete's in trouble, Elena. They're going to bury him. They're saying he's a foreign agent. They're using the fact that he used an encrypted link to transmit the signal as proof of clandestine activity. They're going to destroy him to get to you." Elena felt a cold, sharp blade of guilt twist in her chest. Pete had stayed outside the wire. Pete had done exactly what she'd asked him to do. And now the institution was doing what it did best, isolating the outliers. "What did they offer you, Mac?" she asked. "A full medical, a house in San Diego, a consulting job with Aegis that pays 6 figures for doing nothing. All I have to do is testify that I was disoriented during the mountain recovery and that I didn't see the SUV." He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. "I told them to go to hell, but Elena, I can't walk, I can't fly, my career is done. I've got a wife and 2 kids in Spanaway who are wondering why the MP at our front door won't let them leave." Elena reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold. "You did the right thing, Mac. You saved my life." "I didn't save anything," he said, his voice breaking. "We're sitting in a hospital room under guard while the people who did this are probably having dinner at the officers' club. Thorne is the fall guy, but the system is already healing itself around the wound we made. We're the scar tissue, Elena. That's all we are." "Scar tissue is stronger than regular skin, Mac," Elena said, her voice firm despite the pain. "It's the only part that doesn't break twice." Mac looked at her, and for a second the fear in his eyes was replaced by that old, familiar spark of professional respect. He saw the woman who had dragged him through the snow. He saw the woman who had climbed a crane with a bullet in her side. They're having a board of inquiry on Friday, Mac said. It's not a trial, it's a fact-finding mission. They've hand-picked the board. 3 colonels and a general, all of whom have ties to the next-gen program. They're going to frame it as a mental health issue. They're going to say the stress of the mountain caused you to have a psychotic break, and that the 812 Hz signal was a delusion you manufactured. A delusion that happened to crash a $4 billion helicopter, Elena said. They'll say the crash was a coincidence, a fatigue fracture just like they wanted. If they can discredit you, the data doesn't matter. The truth becomes a symptom of your illness. Mac leaned in closer, his voice a barely audible whisper. There's a man, a journalist from the Seattle Times *. He's been sniffing around the crash. He knows about the SUV. If you can get him the telemetry logs from the mountain, the ones Pete has on the encrypted drive, it won't matter what the board says. It'll be on the front page. Pete has the drive. He hid it before they took him. It's in a maintenance locker at the civilian airfield, Locker 42. The code is the tail number of the first bird you ever worked on. Elena closed her eyes, 84 to 24,332. A Huey she'd spent 6 months rebuilding in Fort Eustis. Pete had remembered. Go back to your room, Mac, Elena said. Don't let them see you talking to me again. If they ask, tell them I'm confused. Tell them I don't remember the mountain. Elena, go, Mac. Take care of your family. Let me handle the machine. He looked at her one last time, a look of profound sorrow and desperate hope, before he turned his wheelchair and rolled out of the room. The door clicked shut, and Elena was alone again with the 412 tiles. The night brought a new kind of tension. It was the tension of a woman who knew she was being hunted by a predator that didn't use claws or teeth but paper and silence. The pain in her side was a constant companion, a rhythmic reminder of the sanitization team's efficiency. She didn't sleep. She spent the hours visualizing the base. She saw the civilian airfield. She saw the maintenance lockers. She saw the path from this hospital room to the perimeter fence. It was a path that seemed impossible, a distance that her broken body couldn't possibly cover. But Elena Vance didn't think in terms of possible. She thought in terms of tolerances. She thought in terms of how much pressure a system could take before it failed. On the 5th day, the personal cost arrived in full. A nurse she didn't recognize came in to change her dressings. The woman was older, with a hard, pinched face and a name tag that read *Miller**. She didn't speak as she peeled back the tape, her movements rough and indifferent. When she saw the wound, the angry red puckering of the entry hole, she didn't offer a word of comfort. "You're the one," Miller said, her voice dripping with a cold, professional disdain. "The one who caused the lockdown. My son is a crew chief over at the 160th. He was supposed to go on leave yesterday. Now he's pulling 12-hour shifts guarding hangars because of your stunt. He says everyone over there hates your guts. Says you're a traitor who's trying to ruin the regiment's reputation to cover for your own mistake in the cockpit." Elena didn't flinch. She watched the woman's hands. "Is that what they're saying?" "It's what the truth is," Miller said, slapping a fresh bandage onto the wound with a force that made Elena's vision go gray for a second. "You pilots think you're God's gift. You think you can break the rules and the rest of us have to pick up the pieces. You're not a hero. You're a liability." The nurse walked out, and Elena felt the weight of it, the specific loneliness of the person who tells a truth that nobody wants to hear. It wasn't just the higher-ups. It was the rank and file. It was the people she had tried to protect. They didn't see the defect. They only saw the disruption. They didn't see the treason. They only saw the canceled leaves and the extra duty. She was becoming the villain in the story of her own life, a ghost haunted by the people she had served. The reckoning for the authority figures continued in the shadows. General Richard Vance, no relation, a fact the press would later find ironic, sat in his office at the Pentagon, looking at a secure monitor. He was a man of the old school, a man who believed in the iron triangle of the military, the defense industry, and the government. He had been the one who signed off on the next-gen program. He had been the one who promised the Senate that the birds were unhackable. On his screen was a report from the NSA. They had intercepted a signal from a foreign embassy in D.C., a burst of data that matched the 812 Hz frequency. The back door that Thorne had been protecting wasn't just a secret for American intelligence. It had been found by the enemy. The edge was already blunt. "We can't bury it," his aide said, a young colonel with a worried expression. "The signal from the base. It was recorded by at least a dozen private scanners in the Tacoma area. It's on the internet, General. People are asking what it is. If we go ahead with the board of inquiry and call Vance crazy, and then a bird falls out of the sky in Poland or Korea because of that frequency. We're not just looking at a scandal. We're looking at a catastrophe. General Vance rubbed his eyes. He looked at a photo on his desk, himself and a young Silas Thorne 20 years ago, both of them lean and hungry, standing in front of an Apache in the Iraqi desert. Silas was a good officer, the general whispered. But he forgot that the machine is only as good as the truth you put into it. He tried to build a house on a foundation of sand. What do we do about Chief Vance? The general looked at the report. She's a problem, but she's a problem we created. We can't buy her and we can't break her, so we do the only thing the Army knows how to do with a problem like that. We put her in a room and see if she survives the process. And if she doesn't? Then we have our scapegoat, the general said, his voice cold and final. Either way, the program continues. The machine must move forward. The weight of the institution was settling onto everyone. It was a slow, grinding pressure that didn't leave bruises, but it crushed the soul. It was the sound of doors closing, of phone calls not being returned, of names being erased from rosters. Elena felt it in the way the doctors spoke over her as if she weren't there. She felt it in the way the MPs shifted their feet when she looked them in the eye. She was being unpersoned. By the 6th day, the physical pain had settled into a dull, manageable roar. Elena began her own maintenance program. She used the bedrail to perform isometric exercises, strengthening her core without making a sound. She used the plastic water pitcher to gauge her grip strength. She mapped the movements of the nurses, the timing of the medication rounds, and the blind spots of the security cameras in the hallway. She was a ghost in the system, and she was preparing to haunt it. At 22:00, the fixer returned. The man in the charcoal suit looked less confident this time. His tie was slightly loosened, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The machine was starting to smoke, and he was the one tasked with putting out the fire. "The journalist has the telemetry, Elena," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "We don't know how he got it, but he has it. He's going to run the story on Sunday." Elena didn't say anything. She knew how he got it. Mac. Pete, the network of people who still believed in the truth. "If that story runs," the man said, leaning over her bed, his voice a low, desperate hiss, "the next-gen program is dead. 10 years of research, $60 billion, and 30,000 jobs. Gone. The Secretary of Defense will have to resign. The President will be humiliated. And you will be the woman who destroyed the American air advantage." "I didn't destroy it," Elena said. "It was already broken. I just told you where the crack was." "It doesn't matter. In the real world, the person who points at the crack is the one who gets blamed when the ceiling falls. We are offering you one last chance. Sign the NDA. Give us the name of the person who leaked the telemetry. If you do, we can stop the story. We can reframe the narrative. We can save Pete. We can save Mac." "You can't save them," Elena said, her voice like cold steel. "You've already decided they're the cost of doing business. You're just trying to negotiate the price." The man stared at her, and for the first time he looked afraid. He realized that he was looking at a person who didn't care about the price. He was looking at a person who was loyal to the mission, and the mission was the truth. "The Board of Inquiry is tomorrow morning at 0800, he said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. "It's being held in the secure briefing room at Building 1. You will be transported there by CID. I strongly suggest you think about your future, Chief, because after tomorrow you won't have one." He left, and the silence that followed was absolute. Elena lay back on the thin pillow. Tomorrow, the final reckoning, the moment where the machine would try to crush the woman who had dared to fix it. She felt the titanium shard in her pocket, the piece of the 402 she had kept. It was a small, jagged thing, but it was real. It was the physical evidence of the failure. She gripped it until the edges bit into her palm, the pain a grounding wire that kept her connected to her purpose. The emotional state of the ward changed as the night progressed. The hospital became a tomb. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic beat of a helicopter taking off from the flight line, a sound that usually brought Elena peace, but now felt like a taunt. Every rotor beat was a reminder of the birds that were still flying with the defect. Every beat was a reminder of the pilots who were still in danger. She thought about Captain Reed. She thought about his face in the cockpit, the way he had looked at her with such absolute trust. Asterisk, fix it, Vance. Asterisk, she would fix it, even if she had to burn her own life to do it. Around 0300, the door opened again. This time it wasn't a suit or a nurse. It was an MP, a young man with a face full of freckles and eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sleep in a week. He was one of the guards who had been outside her door for the last 4 days. He didn't say a word. He walked to her bed and placed a small, plastic bag on the nightstand. Inside was a set of clean BDUs, a pair of boots, and a manila envelope. "What is this?" Elena whispered. The MP looked at the door, then back at her. "Specialist Patterson said to give this to you. He's at the gate," he said. "He said the machine is still broken, ma'am. And he said you're the only one who knows the code." He turned and walked out, returning to his post as if nothing had happened. Elena opened the envelope. Inside was a pass, a physical security badge that would get her through the internal checkpoints of Building 1. And a single note written in Pete's frantic, messy scrawl. "Asterisk, the frequency isn't just a kill switch, Elena. It's a broadcast. They aren't just crashing the birds. They're using them to listen. The back door is a two-way street. Don't let them tell you it's just a defect. It's a feature." Asterisk, the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The sanitization wasn't just a cover-up for a mistake. It was a cover-up for an espionage operation. The technology wasn't flawed, it was compromised by design. And Thorne hadn't just been protecting a stock price. He had been protecting a shadow program that went higher than anyone dared to look. The personal cost was no longer just her career. It was her soul. If she signed the NDA, she wasn't just burying a mistake. She was becoming an accomplice to treason. She sat on the edge of the bed, the pain in her side a screaming reminder of her fragility. She looked at the boots. They were heavy. They were real. She pulled them on, the familiar weight of the leather and the laces giving her a sudden electric surge of purpose. She dressed in the BDUs, her movements slow and agonizing but precise. She pinned her rank to her collar, the silver bar of a chief warrant officer. She looked in the small, stainless steel mirror above the sink. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, a long, jagged scratch running down her cheek. But the gaze was the same. The gaze of a person who knew exactly what the machine was and exactly how to break it. She stepped to the door. She didn't know if the MP would let her out. She didn't know if she would even make it to the elevator. She didn't know if she would survive the day. But as she reached for the handle, she felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The dark competence was back, but it was different now. It was no longer about survival. It was about justice. She opened the door. The MP didn't move. He didn't look at her. He just stared straight ahead, his posture perfect, his weapon slung over his shoulder. "Chief," he whispered as she passed. "Corporal," she replied. She walked down the hallway, the non-slip socks long gone, her boots striking the linoleum with a sound that felt like a drumbeat. She was a ghost no longer. She was a soldier, and she was going to the board. The hospital was quiet, a vast, white labyrinth of sleeping people and humming machines. Elena moved through the shadows, her breath shallow, her side throbbing. She used the security badge to bypass the nursing station, taking the service elevator down to the basement. She emerged into the cold night air. The Washington rain was a fine mist that felt like needles on her skin. She saw the lights of Building 1 in the distance, the headquarters of the I Corps, a massive, neoclassical structure that held the power of the base. She didn't head for the main entrance. She headed for the motor pool. If she was going to the board, she wasn't going as a prisoner. She was going as a maintenance pilot, and a maintenance pilot always arrived with the right tools. She found a HMMWV parked near the maintenance shed. The keys were in the ignition, a common practice on a secure base, a habit of trust that she was about to exploit. She climbed into the driver's seat, the smell of diesel and old canvas filling her nose. It was the smell of her life. She started the engine, the roar of the 6.5-liter V8 was a scream in the quiet of the night, a defiant mechanical shout that echoed off the metal sheds. She didn't look back. She drove toward the heart of the base, the lights of the dashboard reflecting in her eyes. Inside Building 1, the Board of Inquiry was already gathering. The room was a sterile, windowless box filled with the scent of expensive coffee and old paper. The three colonels and the general sat at a long mahogany table, their faces masks of professional indifference. They were the machine's operators, and they were ready to process the outlier. "Where is the prisoner?" General Vance asked, looking at his watch. "She's being transported from Madigan now, sir," a young captain replied. "She should be here in 5 minutes." But Elena Vance wasn't 5 minutes away. She was in the parking lot, sitting in the idling HMMWV, her hand on the manila envelope. She wasn't just going to tell them the truth. She was going to show them. She looked at the building, the seat of the institution that had betrayed her. She thought about Mac in his wheelchair. She thought about Pete in his cell. She thought about Captain Reed in his grave. The cost was paid. The reckoning was here. And the machine was about to find out what happens when you try to sanitize the truth. Elena reached into the envelope and pulled out the small, encrypted drive Pete had left her. She looked at the glowing blue light of the HMMWV's radio console. She knew the frequency. She knew the code. She wasn't going to fix the birds. She was going to fix the world. She put the drive into the radio's USB port. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance," she whispered to the empty cab. "And I'm here for my debrief." She hit the enter key. Across the base, the sirens began to wail, but they weren't the emergency sirens. They were the sound of every radio, every PA system, every secure monitor in Building 1 suddenly coming to life with the same jagged 812 Hz tone. And then the data started to flow. Not the redacted telemetry, but the raw, unedited logs of the two-way street. The names, the coordinates, the proof of the feature. Elena watched the front doors of Building 1 fly open. She saw the MPs spilling out, their faces filled with confusion and fear. She saw the lights in the general's office flickering as the system began to overload. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She sat in the driver's seat, her hands on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the entrance. She was the woman who knew what she knew. And finally, the whole world was going to know it too. The resolution was still a heartbeat away, hidden in the chaos of the crashing systems and the shouting men. The final release hadn't come yet. The pressure was still rising, the needle pinned in the red, the engine of the institution screaming as it tore itself apart. Elena Vance closed her eyes for 1 second, listening to the sound of the machine failing. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Then she opened her eyes, gripped the steering wheel, and waited for the door to open. The rain hitting the hood of the HMMWV sounded like 1,000 typewriter keys, recording a confession that nobody was supposed to hear. Elena sat behind the wheel, her hands resting at the 9 and 3 positions, watching the steam rise from the vents. The smell of hot coolant and wet asphalt filled the cab, a sharp, industrial scent that grounded her as the world outside the windshield dissolved into chaos. In the rearview mirror, she saw the first wave of MPs cresting the rise near the motor pool, their blue and red lights fracturing against the rain-streaked glass. They didn't know yet that the signal she had just released was already halfway to the servers at the *Seattle Times*, and 3 different secure repositories across the country. They only knew that a chief warrant officer had stolen a vehicle and triggered a base-wide security event. The door of the HMMWV didn't just open. It was wrenched back by a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and dipped in olive drab. He didn't scream. In the 75th Ranger Regiment and the Special Operations community surrounding JBLM, screams were for people who had lost control. This man, a sergeant first class with a face full of scars and eyes that had seen too many horizons, simply pointed a Beretta M9 at the bridge of Elena's nose. His breath hitched in the cold air, a small white cloud that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Hands on the dash, Chief," he said. His voice was a low, vibrating growl that barely carried over the drumming rain. "Don't make me do this, not tonight." Elena didn't move her hands to the dash. She moved them to her lap, palms up, the universal sign of the unarmed and the exhausted. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the name tape on his chest, *Miller*. The nurse's son, the one who was supposed to be on leave, the one who had been told she was a traitor. "It's done, Sergeant," Elena said. Her voice was thin, a dry rattle in her chest, but it didn't tremble. "The frequency isn't coming from me anymore, it's coming from everywhere." Behind Miller, the main doors of Building 1 burst open. The general and his retinue spilled out onto the concrete portico, looking less like the masters of the military-industrial complex, and more like men who had just watched their house burn down from the inside. The signal she had broadcast wasn't just noise. It was a digital skeleton key. It had unlocked every encrypted file Thorne had tried to bury, every communication log between the base and Aegis systems, and the specific, damning telemetry from the 402 that proved the kill switch was actually a remote access portal. Miller's eyes flickered to the building, then back to Elena. He saw the silver bar on her collar, the master aviator wings pinned to her BDU blouse, and the dark, wet stain on her side where the stitches were starting to fail. He saw a soldier who was dying on her feet to tell a truth he had been told was a lie. He lowered the Beretta an inch, just an inch. But in the world of tactical tolerances, an inch was a mile. "Get out of the vehicle, ma'am," he said, his voice losing its edge. Slowly, Elena stepped out, her boots hitting the puddles with a heavy, final splash. The pain in her side was no longer a dull roar. It was a white-hot spike that threatened to short-circuit her nervous system. She leaned against the HMMWV's cold metal flank, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Two more MPs moved in, their movements practiced and efficient, zip-tying her wrists behind her back. The plastic bit into her skin, a sharp, cold reminder that the institution always protected itself before it protected its own. They didn't take her to the brig. They took her back inside Building 1, through a side entrance that smelled of floor wax and stale cigarette smoke. They bypassed the grand hallways and the oil paintings of former commanders, leading her down into the windowless belly of the SIF, the sensitive compartmented information facility. This was where secrets went to live, and where people went to be erased. She was placed in a room that was 10 feet by 10 feet, containing a metal table, 2 chairs, and a clock on the wall that ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical judgment. The air was cold, recycled through high-efficiency filters that stripped it of any scent of the outside world. There was no water, no medical attention for the wound that was now actively bleeding through her BDUs, just the silence. It lasted for 3 hours. In that time, Elena practiced the only thing she had left, control. She slowed her heart rate. She visualized the wiring diagrams of the next-gen flight control system, tracing the phantom pathways of the 812 Hz signal until she could see the betrayal in her mind's eye. She thought about the 412 tiles in the hospital. She thought about Pete. She hoped he was somewhere safe, somewhere the machine couldn't reach him. The door opened at 05:30. Major Sarah Halloway walked in, carrying a thick black binder and 2 cups of coffee that smelled like heaven and battery acid. She didn't look like a woman who had been up all night, though the slight tremor in her hand as she set the cups down gave her away. She sat across from Elena and looked at her for a long, unblinking minute. "You're a hard woman to find, Elena," Halloway said. She pushed one of the coffees across the table. "And an even harder one to kill, apparently." Elena didn't touch the coffee. Her hands were still bound, her shoulders aching from the unnatural position. "Did the files reach the Times?" Halloway leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just seen the sheer scale of the wreckage. "The Times, the Post, the app, and a dozen congressional staffers. You didn't just leak the data, Chief. You fire-hosed it. By 0900, the Secretary of the Army is going to be sitting in front of a Senate Armed Services Committee emergency session. Aegis Systems stock opened in Frankfurt 2 hours ago. It's currently down 32%. And the birds?" Elena asked. "Grounded, every single one of them, from here to Okinawa. The order came down 30 minutes ago. Indefinite operational pause for safety of flight inspections." Halloway sighed, the sound echoing in the small room. "You were right about the two-way street. The signal wasn't just for crashing them. It was a data siphoning protocol. Any bird with that sensor suite was essentially a flying vacuum cleaner for every bit of SIGINT in its radius. And it wasn't just Aegis listening. We found the handshake protocols. They were selling the feed to third-party contractors who were, in turn, selling it to unnamed foreign entities. You didn't just find a defect, Elena. You found a treasonous revenue stream." The weight of the words sat in the room, heavier than the concrete walls. Elena felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. She had won, the truth was out. But she was still in zip ties, her side was still bleeding, and she was still the woman who had broken the rules of the tribe. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Halloway stood up and walked to the door. She signaled to the guard outside. A moment later, the door opened, and a medic walked in with a trauma kit. He didn't say a word as he cut the zip ties and began to work on Elena's side, his movements professional and devoid of judgment. "Now," Halloway said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the machine tries to decide if it wants to thank you or destroy you. Silas Thorne has already been moved to a federal holding facility. He's talking. He's trying to trade names for a reduced sentence. General Vance, the other one, is currently retiring for personal reasons effective immediately. But the program itself, the $60 billion baby, they're going to try to save it. They're going to call it a rogue element within the contractor's office. They're going to try to make you the whistleblower who collaborated with the investigation from the start." "I didn't collaborate," Elena said, wincing as the medic applied an antiseptic. "I fought them every step of the way." "I know that," Halloway said, "but the Army needs a hero right now to distract from the fact that they almost let the entire air fleet be compromised by a line of code. They want to give you a Distinguished Service Cross and a quiet medical retirement. They want you to go away, Elena. They want you to move to a cabin in Montana and never talk to a journalist again." "And if I don't?" Halloway looked at the floor. Then they'll proceed with the charges of theft of government property, unauthorized access to classified systems, and desertion. They'll bury you in Leavenworth, and by the time you get out, nobody will remember why you were there. The news cycle moves fast, Chief. In 3 days, people will be talking about the next thing. The only person who will still be living this story is you. The medic finished the dressing and packed his kit, leaving as quietly as he had entered. Elena rubbed her wrists, the feeling slowly returning to her fingers. She looked at the coffee, now cold, and then at the black binder. "I want to see Mac," she said. "He's in the recovery wing. The MPs are gone. He's a free man, Elena. A free man with a wheelchair and a story nobody wants him to tell. And Pete. Pete is Pete. He's currently in a safe house in Olympia being guarded by some people I trust. He's got enough evidence to keep him safe for a lifetime. He's actually enjoying himself. He asked if I could get him some decent Thai food." Elena felt the first spark of real relief. It wasn't the victory she had imagined. There was no parade, no public vindication. Just the quiet, grinding reality of a bureaucracy trying to find a way to absorb a shock it couldn't ignore. The following days were a blur of sterile rooms and gray-suited men. They moved her from building 1 to a secure transition facility that was essentially a high-end hotel with bars on the windows. She was interviewed by the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, and a half-dozen congressional investigators. She told the story exactly as it happened, over and over, until the words lost their meaning. She described the mountain. She described the frequency. She described the look on Silas Thorne's face when the PA system started to scream. The fixer returned on the 4th day. He looked older, his charcoal suit replaced by a more casual navy blazer, but the mathematical knot in his tie was still there. He didn't sit down this time. He stood by the window, looking out at the rain-drenched runway of McCord Field. "The deal is on the table, Chief Vance," he said. He didn't look at her. "The DSC, the full medical and a non-disparagement agreement. You sign and you walk. You get to be the hero. You get to see Specialist Mackenzie get his pension. You get to see Pete Mackenzie walk free. It's a clean win." "Clean?" Elena asked, her voice flat. "There's nothing clean about this. You're asking me to sign a paper that says I was part of a planned operation. You're asking me to lie for the institution that tried to kill me." "I'm asking you to be a pragmatist," the man said, finally turning to face her. "The technology is being fixed. Aegis is being gutted. The people responsible are going to jail. What more do you want? Do you want to be a martyr? Do you want to spend the next 20 years in a cell just to say you didn't sign a piece of paper?" Elena stood up, her side still aching but her posture straight. She looked at the man, and for the first time she felt pity for him. He was a part of the machine, a gear that existed only to keep the other gears turning. He didn't understand loyalty. He only understood liability. "I want to go home," Elena said, "and I want my boots back." He stared at her for a long time, searching for a crack, a moment of hesitation, a price. He found nothing. Elena Vance was a woman who had been through the fire and come out as something harder, something more permanent. "Fine," he said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a single, thin folder. "Sign the DD 214. You're officially retired for medical reasons. You'll receive your benefits. The medal will be sent to your home address. There will be no ceremony, no press. You are effectively a ghost, Chief. I hope you enjoy the silence." Elena signed the paper. She didn't read the fine print. She knew what it was. It was the price of her freedom and the price of Mac's life. She handed the pen back to him, her movements precise, her face a mask of controlled indifference. "I've lived in the silence my whole life," she said. "I'm used to it." She walked out of the room, through the secure doors, and into the light of a Washington afternoon that was finally, mercifully clear. The transition was quiet. There were no cameras at the gate. There was no one waiting to greet her. She took a cab to the civilian airfield where Pete had hidden the drive. She found locker 42 punched in the code, 84 to 24,332, and found her old duffel bag. Inside were her boots, her civilian clothes, and a small, worn photograph of her father standing in front of a Huey in 1969. She drove a rental car south, away from the base, away from the hangars, away from the mission that had almost cost her everything. She stopped at a diner in Centralia, a place that smelled of fried onions and old coffee. She sat in a booth in the back and watched the people, civilians who had no idea that their world had almost been compromised by a signal they couldn't hear. They were talking about the weather, about the local high school football team, about the price of gas. It was a beautiful, mundane reality that she had fought to protect, and they would never know her name. She visited Mac 2 days later. He was at a private rehab facility in the foothills of the Cascades, a place with a view of the mountains and air that smelled of cedar and rain. He was sitting on a deck, his wheelchair positioned so he could watch the hawks circling over the valley. He looked better. The color was back in his face, and the haunted look in his eyes had softened into a quiet, resigned peace. He didn't hear her approach. She stood behind him for a moment, watching the way he watched the world. He was a man who had been broken by the machine, but he was still here. He was still breathing. "The hawks are out today," she said. Mac didn't jump. He just nodded, a small, slow movement. "They've got the thermals. They don't even have to flap. They just exist." Elena sat in the chair next to him. They didn't talk about the board. They didn't talk about Thorn. They didn't talk about the DSC that was currently sitting in a cardboard box in the trunk of Elena's car. They talked about the mountains. They talked about the way the light changed as the sun hit the snow. "You're leaving," Mac said after a while. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow morning. I'm heading east, Montana. I've got a friend with a ranch near Big Sky. He needs someone who knows how to fix tractors and keep the generator running." Mac looked at her, his eyes wet. "You saved us, Elena, you know that, right? Not just me and Pete, all of them." "I did the maintenance, Mac," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "The machine was broken. I fixed it. That's all it was." "It was more than that," he said, reaching out to take her hand. His grip was weak, but his touch was warm. "It was the truth, and the truth is the only thing that doesn't break." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. It was the specific, earned silence of two people who had seen the worst of the world and decided to stay anyway. It was a silence that didn't need to be filled with words or excuses or justifications. It was just there. The next morning, Elena Vance drove across the state line. The landscape changed from the lush, dripping green of the coast to the wide, golden expanses of the high desert. The air became dry and cold, smelling of sagebrush and dust. She felt the weight of the last few weeks slowly lifting, not disappearing, but settling into a part of her where it could be managed. She reached the ranch late in the evening. It was a sprawling, rugged piece of land at the end of a long, dirt road. There was a small cabin, a large barn, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Her friend, a retired sergeant major named Hauer, was waiting for her on the porch. He didn't ask her any questions. He just handed her a beer and pointed to the barn. "The John Deere's got a leak in the hydraulic line," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "And the generator is throwing a code I don't recognize. Figure you can handle it." Elena looked at the barn, then at the vast, star-filled Montana sky. "I can handle it." She spent the next few weeks in a rhythm of physical labor. She woke up at dawn, her side still stiff but the pain manageable. She worked on the machines, her hands covered in grease and oil, her mind focused on the simple, honest logic of gears and valves. She didn't watch the news. She didn't check the internet. She lived in the world of the tangible. The cost of her truth-telling was still there. She would never fly again. Her medical records made sure of that. The trauma to her ribs and the scarring on her lungs meant that high-altitude maneuvers were a thing of the past. She would never wear the uniform again. She would never lead a flight of 402s into a storm. That part of her was gone, burned away in the fire of the mountain and the SIF. But as she stood in the barn one evening, wiping the grease from her hands with a rag that smelled of diesel, she realized that she wasn't broken. She was just different. She was a woman who had found the limit of her loyalty and realized it didn't end with the institution. It ended with herself. She walked out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. In the distance, she heard the sound of a civilian helicopter, a Bell 206 by the sound of the rotor beat, ferrying tourists or supplies to one of the mountain resorts. She watched it move across the sky, a small, dark shape against the gold. She didn't feel the old, sharp pang of longing. She didn't feel the need to be in the cockpit. She just watched it fly, knowing that the sensors were clean, knowing that the code was honest, knowing that the person at the controls was safe. She went into the cabin and sat at the small wooden table. She pulled out the cardboard box she hadn't opened since she left Washington. Inside was the Distinguished Service Cross. It was a beautiful thing, a gold cross with an eagle in the center, suspended from a blue and white ribbon. It was the second highest award for valor the United States Army could give. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the Board of Inquiry. She thought about the fixer and his navy blazer. She thought about the lie they wanted her to tell to earn this piece of metal. She put the medal back in the box and tucked it into the back of a drawer. It didn't matter. The medal wasn't the reward. The reward was the silence. The reward was the fact that Mac was alive. The reward was the knowledge that she hadn't flinched when the machine tried to crush her. She walked back out to the porch and sat in the rocking chair, her boots resting on the railing. She watched the first stars begin to poke through the deepening blue of the sky. The air was cold now, a sharp Montana cold that made her breath come in small, white clouds. She thought about the 412 tiles. She thought about the 812 hertz signal. She thought about Captain Reed and the way the fire had looked against the snow. She was a maintenance pilot, and she had fixed the bird. A truck pulled up the long driveway, its headlights cutting through the dusk. It was Hauer returning from town with supplies. He stepped out of the truck, carrying a bag of groceries and a newspaper. He walked up the steps and handed the paper to Elena. "You made the front page," he said. Elena looked at the headline. Asterisk Air Defense Scandal, Whistleblower Vindicated as Senate Demands Accountability. Asterisk There was no photo of her. The Army had made sure of that, but the story was there, the truth was there. It was written in black and white, a permanent record of the failure and the cost. "They got it right," Elena whispered. "They usually do eventually," Hauer said, leaning against the railing, "if someone's willing to pay the price to show them where to look." He went inside, leaving Elena alone with the paper. She didn't read the article. She didn't need to. She had lived it. She just looked at the date, Tuesday morning, and remembered the Kaya O.L. Oder en Yeru Ikratkoi breakfast in Billings, Montana, all those years ago when she had first decided to serve. The circle was closed. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the dark valley. The world was quiet. The machine was still, its gears and levers resting in the dark. She felt a strange, deep sense of belonging, not to an institution or a mission, but to the earth beneath her feet and the air in her lungs. She was Elena Vance. She was a soldier. She was a survivor. And she was finally, truly home. She went inside and closed the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, a small, final note of certainty in the night. The light in the cabin flickered once, then settled into a steady, warm glow that reached out into the darkness. A small beacon in the vast, silent heart of the country she had served. The rain had stopped, and the stars were out, and for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an answer. The world was as it should be, and she was the only one who knew the cost of its peace. She slept that night without dreaming, her breath steady and slow, the sound of the Montana wind the only frequency she needed to hear. In the morning, she would get up and fix the generator. She would check the fences. She would live her life, one breath at a time, one day at a time, a woman of dark competence and quiet truth. The machine would keep turning, somewhere far away, but she was no longer a part of its mechanism. She was the ghost that had broken the gear, the scar tissue that had made the system stronger, the pilot who had found the ground and decided to stay. Everything she had done had cost her something, but as she woke to the light of a new day, she realized that she had kept the only thing that mattered. She had kept her soul. And in the end, that was more than enough. The sun rose over the mountains, casting a golden light across the ranch, and Elena Vance stepped out into the morning, her boots finding the rhythm of the earth as she walked toward the barn. She had work to do. The bird was fixed. The mission was over. The silence was hers.